Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The birth was a success. The little boy weighed a healthy 8 pounds flat and had a tiny crop of black hair. Though the baby came out breached, Dr. Felix was able to save it. He cut the umbilical cord and washed the amniotic fluid off its pink skin. Smiling, the doctor wrapped it in the blanket. The room was small. Felix had added it to his home after his wife had gotten sick. With his wealth, he had built her a fully furnished hospital room with the latest in medical technology. Since her illness, he had kept it much the same, though now he had added a crib that, if needed, doubled as an incubation unit. Felix placed the infant into the crib and was glad he hadn't needed the incubator. This one would be strong enough to survive the trip.
"Can I hold him?"
the baby's mother asked from the bed. She looked older than she was. Her features were tired, the weathered skin strained across her face. The plumpness of her cheeks showed she had once forgone food in exchange for self-abuse. Her thin hair stuck to her forehead like spider webs. In a trembling voice, she told Dr. Felix,
I just want to hold him a minute."
"That wasn't part of the agreement," he said, his tone even. Dr. Felix looked at her. He was a handsome man in his 40s, his frame fitting a paternal archetype. Yet there was a razor's edge to his stare. He wasn't annoyed, wasn't angry, but a severity hung about him that even the woman, doped up as she was, couldn't ignore.
I know,
she said, swallowing though her sandy throat made it difficult.
but I just wanted to.
"Caitlin," he said, adding a tinge of venom to her name. "Need I remind you of our agreement? It had very explicit terms."
No, I don't. I just thought that.
she muttered. Dr. Felix walked over to the side of the bed. The woman shrank a bit as though he were the shadow of death itself. "Your thoughts are irrelevant," he explained. "I didn't save your life, nurse you back to health, and spare no expense at either endeavor so you could give me your thoughts. Do you understand? You will be paid, yes? You'll be a very rich woman, right? So."
I only wanted to look.
He smiled down at her. The expression was devoid of warmth. "Why did we make this arrangement if you cared to look?" he asked. "Why did I find you with a baby in your belly and a needle in your arm if you cared to look?"
I was on some heavy stuff.
"A bargain was made," he said right through her voice. "The terms were set. Abide by them." He stepped away, sighing. She'd come to understand it as an imitation of emotion. He did them often in their time together. Dr. Felix tried to seem caring, helpful, and even understanding, but there was something in his stance, his mannerisms, that made her think it was all mimicry. Like he had watched people having genuine emotions, studied them, and now pantomimed what he had seen. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "I understand this all must be distasteful," he said, reaching into his pocket. He took out a black case no bigger than a pack of cigarettes. "But think of all you're gaining. You'll never have to work again. Never have to stand on the cold corners hoping the next John won't kill you. And for what? Being treated like a queen for 6 months. Most people would do much worse for much less, I assure you." She couldn't look him in the eye.
"What are you going to do with him?"
she asked. Placing the case on her lap, he told her, "That is not part of the agreement. Inside you'll find a bank card with a PIN number. The money I promised is available, and there's a little something extra. Consider it a parting gift. Don't worry, I can attest to its purity. Use it here if you'd like. You earned it. Now, if you'll excuse me, we must be going." He turned his back to her and went to the infant.
What do you want him for?
She asked again, looking at the case in her lap. He scooped the child into his arms. "That was not part of the agreement," he repeated. 2. Driving through the empty streets, Dr. Felix knew the woman would be dead before he returned. He had put the purest heroin he could buy in that case, and on the off chance she could tolerate that larger dose, he cut it with a little bromadiolone. When he had found her, she was so strung out, she was hardly a person, barely even an animal. Getting clean, she had screamed for it, even tried suicide a few times. Once she died for 3 minutes before he revived her. But once a month sober, she'd confided in him that it was her 4th try getting clean, and that she saw Dr. Felix as a kind of savior. But he knew he was anything but a benevolent caretaker. All those years ago, he couldn't even save his wife Ivy. All his knowledge, all his money, all the priests and holy men and practitioners of the dark arts were impotent in the face of her malady. The medicines made her worse, the surgeries weakened her, and all the prayers and rituals did was transform her into a thing beyond saving. Something hopeless that lived yet had no life, a thing that wore his wife's skin but had none of her soul. Before long, there had been no place left for her to go. The asylums couldn't save her. Hospitals couldn't understand. Months after she stopped speaking, Dr. Felix decided to place her alongside other Felixes in the family crypt. The dead judged no one. They wouldn't scoff at what she had become. They'd see her as lasting proof of her husband's devotion. Still, he hated thinking of her there because all it did was remind him of how beautiful she had been before the sickness changed her. She used to wear the finest clothes, had closets filled from trips to Milan, New York, Harajuku. Now, whenever he brought her a new outfit, he'd see it shredded up in the corner with the other clothes he had gifted her over the years. Now, all her old skill with the makeup brush couldn't hide the waxen hue of her skin, or how far her once vibrant eyes had sunk into her face. The thought clung to him as it always did, until he had reached the cemetery gates. The groundskeeper had been paid to unlock the gates. He didn't even ask why a wealthy man wanted access to the graveyard every 9 months or so. 3. Dr. Felix parked on one of the paths hidden from the main road and took the baby into his arms. It fussed a little since the sedatives he'd given it were wearing off. The night was cold, so the doctor held the baby to his chest as he stepped onto the hallowed ground, passing tombstones both old and new. He needed no lights. He could find the Felix crypt even in the dark. It stood over 15 feet tall with Grecian columns serving as the facade around its entirety. The full length of it was big enough for whole families of dead, or as he often mused, big enough for every Felix who'd ever lived except himself. The steps up to the heavy iron door were overgrown with sprigs of grass, but he had expressly told the groundskeeper to leave them. Looking neglected, no one would suspect anything was in the crypt other than legacies turned to dust. Dr. Felix stood in front of the door, adjusting the baby in his arms. "Sweetheart, I brought you something," he called. Though no sound came from the other side of the door, he knew she was in there waiting eagerly for his visit. He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the chains on the door. At the sound of the heavy links, something within the crypt shuffled across the dusty floor. Its husky breath was both fearful and aggressive. Dr. Felix pried open the heavy door and winced at the stench of damp rot that came from the open portal. Once she had smelled like perfume. When the door was open enough to fit through, Dr. Felix shimmied inside and let his eyes adjust to the dark. The oppressive smell of the place prodded the baby awake. Its sedated cries were dreamy and weak. Still, they bothered the figure huddled in the corner. In the dark, it was an emaciated jumble of limbs, filthy nails, and a mess of oily brown hair that encased its head like a primitive diadem. It clawed the air from a corner piled up with ribbons of silk and chiffon. The baby cried louder. Dr. Felix cooed at the newborn. "Shh, hush now. Don't be afraid. That's my wife, Ivy. She loves little babies. She wants to play with you. That's all. Isn't that right, love?" He went down to one knee and laid the infant between them. Dr. Felix enjoyed none of what came next. The initial sniffing, the infant cries, the feasting. All of it while knowing it was his wife doing it. Sick as she was, those fingers that skewered the infant's new flesh were the same he had held when he had proposed. The lips, soon to be covered in gore, were the ones he had kissed before God and his family on their wedding day. The eyes he used to lose himself in would roll over white, and there'd be nothing human about her until the meal was done. Once it was all finished, her hunger sated, there'd be a brief moment when her eyes showed the same vibrant intelligence that had hypnotized him all those years ago. She'd look at him and her bloody lips would thin into a smile, and she'd almost say his name, almost tell him she loved him before reverting back to that scared thing huddled in the corner. He'd do anything for those precious seconds, those moments she'd be released from the hells heaped on her. She was his wife, after all. Dr. Felix sat back against the nameplates of his distant ancestors and waited to see the eyes he fell in love with once more, as the scared thing in the corner crept closer to examine his gift.
Dak and Chadwick each lit up a smoke and cracked their windows, the excitement of a good day fishing warming their spirits despite the cold wind that suddenly filled the cab of Chadwick's truck. Sporadic raindrops began to fall as they left the river pooled in the road and splashed off the deeply grooved tires of the smoky old diesel truck, creating a cascading wave of dirty water, sloshing on both sides of the truck.
"I cannot believe that big bass's energy today,"
Dak cried out, elated at the day's catch. "Easy for you to say. All I got was that damn throwback." Chadwick rolled his eyes as the words left his mouth. Headlights passed by as they reveled in their elevated mood. Dak reached over to the center of the console and spun the volume knob on the radio.
"I need to take a nature break, if you know what I mean,"
Dak informed Chadwick as he was exiting the interstate onto the maze of back roads that connected the interstate to his home. "Sure thing. Let me find a good spot," he answered, not bothered at all by taking a short break from the 2-hour-long drive. Chadwick slowed as he looked around for a safe, secluded place to use as nature's urinal as a street sign entered their field of vision. Chadwick slowed, squinting to read the sign. Light Road. It's dark. Maybe it's an ironic street name. Chadwick chuckled as he turned his truck onto Light Road.
"That's perfect. Look at that dead-end turnaround up there,"
Dak said, his words beginning to carry an air of urgency. Chadwick slowed as he neared the dead end and turned his truck back around towards the direction they had come from. "There you go. There won't be anything on my seats today," Chadwick chided, shutting his engine down to not disturb the neighbors with his loud exhaust. Chadwick climbed down out of his cab and proceeded to take care of business as Dak did the same. A loud rustling was heard in the woods on the passenger side of the cab. "You good over there?" "Thought I heard something," Chadwick asked Dak. his anxiety beginning to creep up on him like a predator silently hunting prey.
Yeah, I heard something too. Sounds big,
Dak replied, his voice shaking just enough for Chadwick to notice the change. Let's hurry up and get going. It's probably a fox or something, but better to not find out. Just in case, Chadwick suggested, his feet now flat on the floor in his cab. The rustling was growing louder as Dak hurried into the opposite side of Chadwick's truck. Chadwick turned the key to the on position, the dash lights illuminating the cab in a soft glow. He turned it farther to the start position and was shocked to find that the starter wouldn't crank.
I thought you fixed that,
Dak exclaimed worriedly. No, damn it. Money's tight, man, Chadwick replied, a look of embarrassment covering his face.
No biggie. We'll just call someone to pick us up and we'll deal with it tomorrow. Sound good?
Dak asked, his tone softening. Chadwick glanced at his phone, the blank screen revealing that his battery was dead. My battery's dead. I don't have a charger in here. How are you looking? Chadwick asked, his embarrassment growing. Dak looked at his phone.
Oh my God, no signal. What kind of backwoods place did you bring me to?
Dak asked, annoyance entering his tone again. Didn't you find this road? Chadwick asked, deflecting the blame to his younger friend.
What do we do?
Dak asked, residual fear resonating in his voice. The old guys say that if you tap the starter with something heavy, like a hammer, then it might kick over, Chadwick suggested, climbing out of his cab to root around in his toolbox. Dak waited inside the cab and stared out the window aimlessly. After a few moments, he turned to look at Chadwick to see if he had found something useful. Fear overtook his senses as he looked around for his friend.
What the hell?
Dak thought as he jumped out of the truck, frantically trying to locate his friend. Dak reached the truck's tail end, finding Chadwick bent down, tying his shoe out of view of the cab.
Damn it, Chadwick!
Dak exclaimed angrily. What? Chadwick asked, clearly confused by Dak's reaction.
Never mind. Did you find anything?
Dak asked, intentionally changing the topic quickly. Nope, nothing that I think will work. I had my tools out last weekend. I guess I forgot to put them back in. The toolbox is basically empty. Chadwick shrugged as he walked back to the cab. The sound of the truck doors slamming shut seemed like the equivalent of a coffin being sealed shut for the two young men. Their perception of the silence and the cold inflated to extremes as they sat in their respective seats, watching their breath fog the windows. Chadwick passed the time looking at the details of the two houses to their left. Up until just a moment ago, both houses had been completely dark. The second house on the left now emitted light in two separate downstairs windows. Chadwick rolled down his window and lit up a smoke. You think the people at either two of these houses would help us out? Maybe use their phone or something? Chadwick suggested, grasping for some sort of solution.
I don't know, man. It's late. And what if these yokels are crazy or something?
Dak asked. I'm sure they're normal, nice people. Besides, it's only 8 p.m., Chadwick said, staring at the house with the light on. The second house on the left now had the porch light on, and lights inside the house. Well, look at that, Chadwick exclaimed as a man and woman walked towards his truck.
I got a bad feeling,
Dak muttered as Chadwick climbed out of the truck to greet the people as they approached.
You boys in some sort of trouble?
The man asked. The man stood about 6 feet tall. His black hair was cut short, revealing weathered facial features that only old age could bestow upon a man. His wife stood at a slight 5'2", creating a vast height difference between them. Her hair was gray and long, and her skin bore a resemblance to the consistency of a long-past ripe avocado. Her long, painted nails stuck out from her fingers like crude daggers.
This feels wrong. Look at these guys, man.
Dak muttered under his breath. Yes, sir, we are. I believe my starter's dead in the water and our cell phones seem to be giving us a hard time. Chadwick explained as Dak continued muttering under his breath about his disapproval of their situation.
How can we help?
The woman asked in a raspy voice. A phone would be awesome, Chadwick suggested as the raindrops descended more rapidly on the concrete.
Come on in, boys. Let's get you out of the rain and we'll figure it out.
The old man offered, waving his hand in the direction of his 2-story home across the street.
No, Chadwick. No way.
Dak said, as Chadwick started to walk towards the old couple's home. Come on, Dak. Are you really going to spend the time out here by yourself? Chadwick asked sarcastically.
Damn it,
Dak thought, as he climbed out of the truck and joined his friend as he walked into the house. The 2 young men entered through the front door into a small mudroom. The first thing that they noticed inside the home was a wall-mounted topographical map of the state of Idaho. What the fuck? Chadwick thought, as his gaze settled on the map. You guys like potatoes? Chadwick asked, stifling a laugh. The old couple looked at him questioningly. Never mind. My bad, Chadwick said, backpedaling his words.
My name is Martha. This is my husband, Wilbur.
The older woman said, pointing at herself and then her husband. I'm Chadwick, and this is Dak, Chadwick said politely.
Welcome to our home, boys,
Wilbur said as he led them into the kitchen. The kitchen walls were adorned with some of the strangest wall art either of the 2 of them had ever seen. The most prominent being a large painting of an apple sawing a pear in half. The second most notable was a 4x4 canvas of 2 spider monkeys, playing tug-of-war with an unknown bird species. The image that stuck out the most in Chadwick's mind was a small painting of a young child, building a small toy structure using severed fingers in place of toy blocks. Chadwick shuddered.
I see the cold is seeping into your bones. Come, warm yourself by the fireplace,
Wilbur suggested. No, I'm not cold. It's your creepy paintings, Chadwick thought, as he followed Wilbur into another room. How about that phone? Chadwick asked Wilbur as the old man sat down in a chair.
Oh dear, I thought I mentioned that already. I'm afraid our phone lines have gone down with this strange intermittent storm we've had today,
Wilbur explained as Chadwick felt a ball begin to tighten in his stomach. Chadwick looked around and began to wonder where Dak was. Do you know where my buddy Dak is? Chadwick asked Wilbur as he watched him rock in his chair.
Oh, I think Martha sat him down while she cooks up some food for you boys,
Wilbur answered, rocking faster. Chadwick glanced at the man just in time to see a shadow race across the room from left to right. What was that? Chadwick asked, pointing towards the area that he saw in the movement seconds ago.
Not sure what you mean,
Wilbur asked, appearing slightly confused. Is there anyone here besides you and Martha? Chadwick inquired anxiously.
No, just us 2. Why do you ask?
Wilbur questioned. Never mind, I thought I saw something. I must just be tired, Chadwick explained. A loud bang rang out from the kitchen. Chadwick left the room he was currently in and retraced his steps back to the kitchen.
Oh, blasted cat!
Martha yelled as Chadwick entered the kitchen. Chadwick watched as a black and white cat scurried out of the room, stopping to look back at the pile of pots and pans it had knocked over before disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Martha busied herself with quickly picking up the mess that had overtaken her kitchen floor.
Martha, the damn rain is turning to snow,
Wilbur yelled from his rocking chair. Chadwick crossed the kitchen to look out of the lone window. The rain had indeed turned into the start of a ferocious winter storm. He sighed. Chadwick squinted as he looked through the snowy haze towards the other side of the road. A lantern, held by a shadowy figure, could be seen bobbing through the woods at a slow pace. Chadwick shook his head and turned around. Martha stood behind him, staring through the window. She hurriedly shut the curtains as Chadwick walked away from the window.
Best not to invade the goings-on of the night,
she said, hastily leaving the kitchen. Chadwick watched her as she left the room. Dak jumped up from his chair as they heard a knock on the door.
Boys, let that be. We're not expecting any company,
Martha called from the living room. Chadwick walked down the hallway to the living room, stopping as a small boy ran by him, giggling like a hyena. What is wrong with these people? Chadwick thought angrily. Why lie about having someone else here? Chadwick entered the living room and approached Wilbur's rocking chair. I just saw your grandson. I thought no one else was here with you two, Chadwick asked accusingly.
We don't have any grandchildren. We never even had children of our own,
Wilbur answered. Chadwick flinched as another knock on the door echoed through the house. Somebody wants you to answer the door, Chadwick said, his frustration rapidly growing.
It's best not to invade the goings-on of the night,
Martha said thoughtfully. Yeah, you said that a few minutes ago. What is going on around here? Chadwick asked. Another knock echoed through the house.
Chadwick!
Dak shrieked from the kitchen. Chadwick ran to the kitchen to find Dak staring out through the front window. What is it? Chadwick asked impatiently.
There's no one at the door,
Dak mumbled, still staring through the window. What the hell are you talking about? Chadwick asked, his fear beginning to grow. Chadwick didn't wait for Dak's answer, opting instead to swing the front door open angrily. Opening the door revealed a glowing white orb, precisely level with Chadwick's line of vision. Chadwick slammed the door and ran back into the kitchen to find Martha and Wilbur standing next to Dak. Is this some kind of joke? Chadwick asked angrily.
I wish it was, son. Come, sit down in the living room. You need to know about the Light Road curse,
Wilbur said, motioning for the boys to return to the living room. Chadwick and Dak reluctantly followed Wilbur back. They watched as Wilbur and Martha took a seat and waited for Wilbur to speak.
Many years ago, my wife Martha used our home for taking care of hospice patients as they endured their last weeks. We even built an addition to accommodate the influx of patients,
Wilbur informed them, his eyes fixed on the fire dancing in the fireplace.
Business was good, and the extra money sure did help around here. Our home was in dire need of repair, and the money we made from her business gave us all the funds we needed and more,
Wilbur continued. What does this have to do with the fucking light banging on your door? Chadwick asked angrily.
Hush, boy, let him finish,
Martha snapped, pressing a wrinkled finger to her lips.
One night we received a patient from the nursing home unannounced. We didn't overthink it, as we readily accepted every patient. I signed the paperwork, and Martha brought her into her room.
Wilbur paused for a moment to light a cigar.
This new patient, her name was Livia. Well, Livia had an intrepid past of causing immense chaos wherever she passed through, unbeknownst to us. We awoke in the morning to find all 6 of our hospice patients dead in their rooms. Livia was gone. Nowhere to be found,
Wilbur said, puffing intermittently on his cigar.
Well, what happened to Lydia?
Dak asked, his eyes wide.
We eventually found Livia in the woods across the street. Her naked body was covered in strange symbols that she had presumably carved into her skin herself.
What does all this have to do with the things happening in your home? Chadwick asked, his want to know more overpowering his fear for the time being.
After a lengthy investigation, the police concluded that she had many more deaths to her name than just the ones she took here. Men, women, and children. They concluded that she was insane. That was the easy answer. However, that is not the truth. The truth is, something drove her. Something lived within that woman. Now that thing resides on this road. It seeks out pure souls on most nights, hiding in shadows until it grows tired of waiting. Then, it grows angry.
Wilbur concluded the story and looked at Chadwick and Dak.
Oh my God,
Dak declared, his voice wavering. We need to get out of here. I don't want any part of this, Chadwick declared frantically.
I'm afraid you mustn't go outside until the morning. You'll surely fall victim to it. You'll have to wait it out here in our home,
Wilbur declared, shifting his gaze from the fire to Chadwick. God damn it! Chadwick exclaimed angrily.
It won't be so bad, child. You and your friend are safe in here.
Martha offered, her voice softening.
Come, I'll show you boys to a room.
Rising to her feet. The boys reluctantly followed Martha down a hallway into a large bedroom.
Here we are,
Martha said, pointing towards a pair of beds opposite of each other at the far end of the room. Everything about this is fucking weird, Chadwick thought, accepting a pillow and blankets from Martha. Martha slammed the door shut on her way out of the bedroom. Chadwick and Dak shuddered as the sound of the deadbolt clicked loudly from the other side of the door.
fuck.
Dak exclaimed, looking frantically around the room. Chadwick looked around the room as well, noticing that it had no windows and no other items inside besides the two beds. Son of a bitch. We fell for that one, Chadwick thought, his inability to recognize the situation unfolding frustrating him immensely.
There must be some way out of here,
Dak declared, quickly coming to the same realization that Chadwick had.
Silly boys. There's no way out from here. Your souls will soon be anchored to this place long after your bodies have rotted and decayed.
Martha cackled through the locked door. The two boys froze as a bang sounded from the wall next to them.
It won't be long. Livia's already here.
Martha screeched, her voice like nails across a chalkboard. Another bang resonated throughout the room, shaking the walls. Dak, this isn't the end for us, bro. We are getting out of here, Chadwick shouted, slamming his shoulder into the bedroom door. Dak joined Chadwick at the door and kicked at the door with all his might. The door began to creak and groan under the continued stress of the two boys repeatedly striking the wooden door. Stand back, Dak, Chadwick yelled before getting a running start and slamming into the door. The door relented, flying open into the hallway, splinters flying in all directions.
Way to go, Chadwick!
Dak shouted, chasing after Chadwick as he fled down the hallway. Chadwick suddenly began furiously backpedaling after seeing Martha coming towards him with a large butcher knife. Dak pushed past Chadwick, screaming as he fearlessly tackled Martha to the ground. Chadwick, seeing the sudden bold action of his friend, pounced on Martha immediately. Martha shrieked as Chadwick wrestled the knife from her grasp.
Don't kill her. I don't want to kill anyone.
Dak screamed, tears filling his eyes. We are fucking leaving, Chadwick exclaimed, holding the knife in front of his body. Martha didn't say a word. She just glared at the boys, her eyes projecting hatred in an immeasurable amount. Wilbur stood at the far end of the hallway, watching the scene before him silently. Dak and Chadwick bolted through the front door and turned down the road, continuing in a full sprint until they found the end of Light Road. The two boys paused after stepping onto Main Street. They looked back in silence. Their gaze finally settled on the lone street light, flickering on and off near the entrance of Light Road.
The nightlight dims as Eddie's restless sleep is broken by a whisper from beyond his bedroom door. "Eddie, come to me, Eddie." "Mom?" He obeys his mother's summons without a second thought, and so steps from bed and crosses the dark room. He peeks out the open door and sees nothing but the moonlit hall. He flips the wall switch, but no light follows. A primal fear grows in him, the fear that all children have for the dark and the things that might lurk therein. "Mom? Mom?" "This way, Eddie. Follow the sound of my voice." Swallowing his fear, he steps into the darkened hall and across to his mother's bedroom. His hand is on the doorknob when the whisper returns. "No, Eddie. This way." The voice now comes from the door to his left, the door that opens to a narrow stairwell and up to the forbidden place. "I can't, Mommy. It's locked, and Dad said never to go in without him." "It's okay, Eddie. I'll unlock the door for you." Click. "Okay," Eddie replies apprehensively as his shaking hand reaches for the knob. The door creaks open and exhales a breath of dust and decay. Eddie couldn't help but imagine it as the mouth of a giant, opened wide and ready for a snack. "Come on, Eddie dear, up the stairs." "I don't want to." His voice was trembling, and tears filled his eyes. "Come." The demanding voice came like an echo from atop the wooden steps. Eddie found that he had no will with which to disobey, and so he ascended, step by creaking step, and all the while it somehow grew darker and darker, until he was forced to navigate by feel alone. Finally, he reached the top and stepped into his father's old workshop, that mystical repository of artifacts and antiquities collected from faraway lands, brought home for refinement and study. He had seen the interior only on rare occasions when his father had something special for Eddie to see. A renowned archaeologist, Mr. Morgan would spend months overseas and in strange, remote places. Sometimes he would come back downtrodden with nothing to show for his work. Sometimes he would come bearing wonderful anthropological marks of human history, but from his last journey he came back not at all. "Don't touch, just look. Everything in here is very delicate. These will all be in museums someday." Eddie's father gestured to the work tables, which held a variety of his latest discoveries, alongside various instruments such as sandpaper, precise cutting tools, and lacquer. He was a man that could never focus on a single project for too long, but he would always come full circle, and the finished product was something to behold. Besides, they're magic, and if you touch them, they might just come to life and eat you up. Eddie's face had taken on the aspect of fright as he eyed the many artifacts under a new light. "They will not," Barbara Morgan playfully smacked her husband's shoulder. "He's just playing with you." Barbara, better known as Mom or Mommy, was almost always in a playful mood those days. Days gone by. She was pregnant with her second child, though she did not know it then. Indeed, It was not until her husband departed on his last expedition that the doctor gave her the news. Mr. Morgan, on the other hand, reached his final destination before ever knowing that he had become a father for the second time, and though he died deprived of one of the happiest moments of his life, at least he would not suffer the heartbreak that would come when his wife miscarried 7 months later. To Eddie's young mind, the attic died with his father. After all, it was a place that could only be accessed by a unique key, a key that no longer existed. It may as well have been a coffin Mr. Morgan was buried in. It felt like a lifetime since he had last been in this room, and it was as dark this night as it was bright then. "Mom?" A shape moved in the darkness and became a dull glow. The glow became a shape, and the shape crouched with arms held wide. "Come here, baby." She was like a beacon in the darkness. He ran to her and flung himself into her arms. "Eddie, I need you to do something for me." "I'm here, Mommy. I want to help. What do I do?" Her hands guided his face to her own. It held the semblance of her features, but instead of warm flesh, there was only cold, dead stone. "Let me out!" she shouted. He awoke screaming. Within a few seconds, his mother rushed in and embraced him. He saw her warm, living face and held on to her as tight as he could. "It's okay. It's okay. You just had a nightmare." Eddie's sobs slowly ebbed. "It wasn't you. Can I sleep with you tonight?" "Sure, honey." Eddie held on tightly to his mother's waist as they walked past the glowing nightlight and into the well-lit hall. Eddie was an easily frightened child, even for his age. But he was also very brave, and the next day, when he passed by the doorway to his father's workshop, he tried the knob. It didn't budge an inch. Relief flooded him, and he was ready to accept that his nightmare was nothing more than a bad dream, a belief that would not survive long. The next night, Eddie once more opened his eyes to a dream world. The nightlight was dark, but the dull glow from the doorway was enough to see by. It came from a stone woman standing, silent as the grave. "Come with me, Eddie." The voice came from the statue, though its carved lips did not move. In fact, he could not be sure that they were words at all. It was more like a feeling, both familiar and alien, that flowed from the figure in the doorway. Eddie was powerless to resist. When he climbed out of bed, the house beneath him rotated around the statue. He barely held his balance. The statue itself did not move, but by the time the house stopped moving, it was facing the hall. Then the house began to move backwards so that the statue's feet scraped against the floor. Eddie followed as if walking on a treadmill. He expected the house to stop again once it reached the door to the attic, but it continued to the stairwell. Once there, the house turned and tilted so that when it moved next, the statue seemed to float down the stairs. It led him to the dining room, and the house finally stopped moving at the cabinet in the corner. Eddie spoke with trembling words. "What now?" The statue made no response, but intuition guided his hand to the highest drawer, one that he could not have reached last year. He looked to the statue for confirmation or denial, but it just stood there, blankly. He pulled on the iron handle. "Ah!" Eddie screamed in pain as a monstrous, inhuman arm grabbed hold of his wrist and crushed it. The bones splintered and broke. He looked at the face, but it had changed from an imitation of his mother's to that of a fully realized demon. It was the face of evil, and it roared like a banshee. Its mouth opened ever wider until the foot-long teeth parted. Eddie felt his eardrums exploding at the sheer volume of the voice. He awoke in his bed, unable to cry out. He couldn't even move. The fear was so great that it paralyzed him, and for a few horrible seconds he believed that he had turned to stone like the statue in his nightmare. The thought passed as he willed himself to breathe in a great gulp of air. He pulled himself out of bed, shaking but emboldened by the glow of the nightlight. He took off his wet pajamas and buried them at the bottom of his laundry basket. He took clean pajamas down the hall to the bathroom and showered like a grown-up. His mother woke, but did not get out of bed. A moment after the shower stopped, her door opened, slowly and quietly. Eddie walked in on tiptoes. She expected to feel him cuddle up against her, but instead, he just stared at her, studying her. She opened her eyes and looked into his. Nightmare? At the sound of her familiar voice, he crawled into bed and pressed tightly against her. The following day, Eddie would not step foot in the dining room. His mind was always on the drawer from the dream. Imagination filled it with 1,000 things, but whether benign or diabolic, all led back to the nightmare visage that nearly killed him with the power of fear alone. He couldn't imagine anything that would be worth the risk of confronting that again. The following night, Eddie delayed bedtime for as long as he could manage. "Mom, I'm going to have another nightmare if I sleep alone. Can I sleep with you, please?" He stretched the last word to emphasize how desperately he wanted her to say yes. "Okay, but this is the last time." After getting ready for bed, Eddie took his nightlight and plugged it into the wall of his mother's bedroom. Then he crawled into bed, closed his eyes, and faded to sleep. Darkness and the fog of dream filled the air when Ed next opened his eyes. His mother's voice called from beyond the closed door, but it was faint and muffled. His mother stood over him with a loving smile, and when he rose to the voice, a hand pressed him down to bed and lulled him back to sleep. He went peacefully, and the hours passed in a haze of slumber. Hours later, he found himself again in darkness, dream fog still heavy in the air. This time he rose from bed of his own volition. His mother was gone, neither watching over him nor in bed where he expected to find her. For perhaps the first time in his life, he knew that he was dreaming. Curiosity overcame fear, and he ventured out into the darkness. The door to the attic was ajar, and a faint light glowed from atop the stairs. "Mom?" He crept up the steps. What would his mother be doing in his father's old workshop at this hour? The room was lit only by the lamps above each workbench, and his focus shifted to survey their contents. They were crowded with ancient artifacts and curios, some packaged for display, while others sat beside brushes and chisels, half encrusted by years of neglect. Stone tablets, effigies, fetishes, and on the last workbench, there sat a skull. Not a human skull, but that of an animal Eddie did not recognize. Maybe an ape? He reached for it, but stopped short. Besides, they're magic, and if you touch them, they might just come to life and eat you up. Suddenly, the skull terrified him, and he whipped around toward the door. His eyes opened wide as he gasped in fright. It was in the middle of the room. How could he have missed it? The bust was the size of a man, only it had no arms or legs, and stood by way of a pole that impaled it from below. It had no face or features of any kind. It occurred to Eddie then that the ancient bust stood where his mother did the last time he dreamt of this room, and as he stared at it, it seemed to change. Slowly, the face began to form, and the body curved to a feminine aspect. The crawling change stopped just after the eyes became discernible. The pupils seemed to twitch, but the stone remained motionless. He stepped slowly towards the door, never taking his eyes off the bust. Finally, turning to leave, he heard a whisper from behind. It was so quiet and strained, he almost couldn't hear it. "Eddie, is that you?" Eddie shook his head vigorously. No. He turned and ran back to his mother's bedroom to hide under the covers till morning. Eddie awoke before his mother and pushed her gently. "Mom? Mommy?" She awoke with a groan. What time is it?" Eddie looked to the alarm clock by the bed and recognized the numbers. 10 o'clock. "You'll have to dress yourself today. I'll make breakfast in an hour." "But I'm hungry, Mommy." "Not now, Ed. Go get dressed." It was 2 hours before Barbara made it down the stairs and into the kitchen. Eddie was already sitting at the table, waiting for breakfast. She moved slowly and clumsily. Her hair wasn't brushed, and she was still in her nightgown. Her face was pale, and there were dark bags under her eyes. Breakfast was a bowl of cereal and a glass of orange juice. Eddie was grumpy with hunger, but restrained his emotions. "Thank you, Mommy." "You're welcome, sweetie." Eddie's sleep was dreamless that night, but when he knocked on his mother's door the next morning, there was no response. "Mom, wake up! Wake up!" He kept knocking, and finally a shout came from beyond the door. "Go away!" She had never shouted at him like that before. It scared him, and he left her alone. When she finally came out, she looked even worse than the day before. "I'm sorry I shouted at you, baby. I didn't mean to. I'm not feeling well." "It's okay, Mommy. I love you." "I love you too, sweetie." Eddie felt like crying. He had hoped his mother would praise him for making breakfast, even if the cereal was soggy. The next morning, Eddie didn't even try to wake her up. Instead, he pulled a chair up to the counter and set up 2 bowls of cereal. He put the milk on the table instead of pouring it into the bowls so that the cereal wouldn't be soggy. After half an hour, he lost his patience and ate alone. The milk was sour by the time Barbara finally made it to the breakfast table. Over the next few days, Eddie would refine his breakfast routine while his mother declined. His sleep had not been dreamless, but they were not the nightmares of before. He was his father, painting a portrait of his mother. He was a dog, following a scent in the woods. He was Superman, rescuing Lois Lane from the Bizarro Superman. But most often he was a fisherman, and in that dream he was lost at sea in a small boat that he did not know how to sail. His fishing rod would quiver, and he would take it and pull. As the reel turned, a shape rose from the deep. The shape seemed to swim toward the line, not against it, but something was binding it to the deep. He would draw the shape ever nearer until the sky darkened, the sea turned violent, and the fear crescendoed within him. He would let go of the rope, and the next dream would come. Each day, Barbara grew more ragged, more agitated, and less patient. He tried to help any way he could, doing her clothes and making her meals. It was heartbreaking to see his mother this way, and whenever he thought of her decline, he couldn't help but remember how the dream statue seemed to morph in the opposite way. The two had been related, but how? He had only one clue, and yet the paralyzing fear threatened to overcome him at the very thought. He made sure that it was broad daylight before entering the dining room. He could feel his heart pounding as he approached the cabinet and the forbidden drawer. He looked back and forth until he was satisfied that there was no one and nothing around. He pulled the drawer open as quietly as he could. The sound of scraping wood. He froze and listened for a response. When none came, he resumed pulling, a little less cautious this time. He looked in. Magazines and power cords? He was confused. His caution abandoned, he dug through the drawer. Power cords? They don't work on people. He knew that. Do they power a medicine machine? What? His hand wrapped around something metal, and it filled him with a certainty that he had found the secret of the drawer. Eddie wished that the secret was something else, anything else, but it wasn't. He went to his room to prepare, telling himself that he would not hide under the bed. He wouldn't. He might. He was going to. He stopped at his toy shelf where he kept his favorite action figures, the ones his dad had bought for him, the ones he loved like family. Batman, the Ninja Turtles, Boba Fett, and his very favorite, Indiana Jones. At times, when he's playing, he forgets that Indy isn't his father. He held them one by one and lingered on the last. Suddenly, he didn't feel like hiding under his bed anymore. He took a deep breath and moved in the direction of his mother's room with the metal from the drawer. Just before reaching the door, he turned to the locked stairwell, placed the metal into the keyhole, and turned. He walked into the giant's fetid mouth and up the stairs to the dream-haunted workshop. He saw, in the center of the room, impaled by a standing pole, the anthropoid stone figure which he feared, only now it looked like a mannequin copy of his mother, even with its limbs extended slightly from the stumps. He sidestepped then, ran to the window, and ripped down the curtains to let in the light. He hoped that the thing would disappear or burn up under the sun. He braced himself in expectation of a horrible banshee wail, but it never came. He didn't know what to do next. The thing was real, and it was changing. It already looked so much like his mother. How would he be able to tell the difference between them when... No, he would always know his mother. Of that, he was certain. He yelled at the statue. "Get out of here! Shoo! I'm not afraid of you!" He grabbed hold of a rock from the table and threw it at the statue. The rock bounced off harmlessly, and the statue made no response. He sat down, frustrated. No ideas. After a moment, he came to a realization. Books are ideas, and there was a whole shelf of those right here in the room. He ran to the shelf and his excitement plummeted. He didn't know any of these books. They were nothing like the fun, colorful ones on his shelf. He couldn't even read all of their titles. He pulled the first, dictionary. He immediately realized that it would do him no good and slid it back onto the shelf. The next one, Egyptian history, was so boring that he started to doze off after the first paragraph. The third book was the worst yet. De Vermi Mysteri. The words inside looked like English, but he couldn't understand a single one. He was getting frustrated fast and threw the book in the trash. With instant regret, he hurried over to it, forgetting his fear of the statue. But then, his attention was intercepted by yet another book. It sat on a workbench like an exhibit. Instantly, he knew that this was the one. It was the most ancient-looking thing he had ever seen. The book, titled Susurris est Deus mortuorum was large and bound in leather. He knew he wouldn't have time to read the whole thing. Instead, he used a trick he had learned all by himself. He laid the book down on its spine, holding both covers gently, and released. The book parted in two directions, each side splitting from the reader's last location. These words were even stranger than those in the black book, but maybe he wouldn't need to read. This book had something the others did not: pictures. As a matter of fact, the illustration on the page to the right told him, without a doubt, that he was on the right track. It illustrated the same bust in that very room, but the one in the picture was bound by chains and hung from an unseen ceiling. He turned the page. The page on the left consisted of the same indecipherable text as the last. Just the sight of it made him dizzy, but the picture, it illustrated the same bust in chains, but there was something else too. To the right of it hung a man. The man was chained like the bust, but unlike it, the man was screaming. The next two pages were too damaged to make out anything significantly different than the last, though he felt that at least one of the figures from the last page remained. He turned the page once more. This time, the image caused him to gasp in horror. The illustration was that of a monster with a long face full of teeth. It was holding a child over its head by one hand, as if about to drop the whole body into its widespread mouth. The ink lines seemed to flex and shiver, and Ed feared the creature would walk out of the page. Ridiculous. He knew it was ridiculous, and yet the lines of ink were moving, slowly, silently. And then the monster's hand released its grasp, and the child fell screaming. The gaping maw snapped shut, and the cartoon droplets of blood flew in all directions. Ed felt something hot and wet splatter across his face. The monster swallowed, and its body bulged out as the child slid down its throat. Eddie was paralyzed in fear as the lines on the page shifted once again. Only one eye was visible when he opened the page, but now the second was slowly appearing as the monster's head seemed to turn and turn until it met Ed's gaze. Then suddenly, the picture changed completely. The blood was gone, and instead of a monster, there stood a man. A man he recognized. Confusion frothed on the surface of terror. Where had the man come from? And where did the monster go? And why was the man smiling so darkly, when only a few pages ago he was screaming in terror, chained up beside the... The confusion evaporated, but the fear only boiled. The smile grew more wicked, as if in response to Ed's realization. That's when the background took shape. At first, the page was blank except for the man, but now darkness bled through from below, filling the yellowed spaces with lines of ink. Ed watched in terrible expectation as the man in chains faded back in, only now he wasn't only screaming, but crying as well. The right page began to flutter, as if begging to be flipped. Ed slammed the book shut instead. He prepared to bolt from the room, but as he turned, his eyes locked onto those of the canonical bust. It had somehow turned in his direction, and the eyes shone with an unbearable nether light. It pulled at him, and he was drawn into that horrible glow like a typhoon. Eddie found himself floating in thin air above his home. The daylight had turned to darkness. He realized that he was holding his breath and forced himself to inhale, half expecting this to fill his lungs with water and drown. No, just autumn air. It was a moonless night, and the streets were layered thick with fog. There were scant streetlights in the suburbs, but the few seemed to form spheres of luminescence. He pushed at the air and propelled himself toward the light. He miscalculated the thickness of fog and hit the ground softly. Unhurt, he leapt high into the air. Once his ascent slowed, he kicked his feet and pulled with his hands as if swimming. He rose back above the streetlight and swam above the fog. He swam upside down, in loops, in every other manner he could think of. He swam to houses and peeked in windows. He swam to school and back. He almost forgot why he was there, but it wasn't long till he felt it tugging. There was no physical sensation, but he was still somehow drawn home. He was within spitting distance of the attic window, moving fast and building up speed. He pulled his head down and his feet forward so that he would land like a cat on the side of his house, a maneuver he practiced a half-dozen times already. With the spin brought his vision back to the incoming house, his eyes went wide, and he frantically kicked and pushed himself to stop. The window had opened. A black shadow had emerged and crawled down the side of the house. It was silent as the grave, fast as the wind, and it wore the darkness like an impenetrable flowing cloak. Moving unbound by gravity, it barely touched the house, seeming to use it only as a source of propulsion. It reached the ground and clung to it, more like an insect than an animal. Ed wasn't even sure it had legs. The creature was at the neighbor's house in the blink of an eye. It half flew, half skittered up the side, stopped without momentum, and peered silently into a bedroom window. It seemed to survey the room with its head shifting and twitching. Mr. and Mrs. Hauser lived in that house, a warm and outgoing couple who loved to see Eddie play. They said he reminded them of their grandchildren. Eddie held his breath, praying that the wraith-like creature would leave them alone. It seemed that his prayers were answered because the creature abandoned its search and crawled down the side of the house. Within a second, it was across the street and starting on the next one. Eddie swallowed his repulsion for the thing and swam after it, intent on keeping as far above and away from it as he could. It was on the side of Anna Jackson's house now. Miss Jackson wasn't the friendliest neighbor. Ed's mother told him never to bother her. She said children annoyed Miss Jackson because she never had any of her own. Eddie didn't want anything bad to happen to her, but he knew that he wouldn't mind as much either. It peeked in on her bedroom window, and Ed held his breath. The curtains were drawn closed, but that didn't seem to matter to the creature. It peered in as if there was nothing but air between it and her. It lost interest and passed to the next house. This is what Ed feared the most. This was Susie's house. Susie was the youngest of 3 siblings and Eddie's best friend. The creature started on the window facing the street, and Eddie flew to the other side where he knew Susie's room was. He didn't have time to slow down. Instead, he landed his feet first on the backyard tree and rebounded straight at his friend's window. He pulled at the sill as hard as he could, but it wouldn't budge, even the slightest bit. He could see her sleeping soundly just on the other side. He pounded his fists on the glass, but not a sound was made. He yelled as loud as he could, but she didn't stir. What could he do? He looked around frantically. Could he throw a rock? Could he even hold one? His gaze turned upwards, and his eyes stopped dead. Peering down from the roof was the wraith-like creature. Its face was nothing but darkness, but Ed was certain it had its sight locked on him. He froze, and his fingers slipped from the window frame. He sank to the ground, as if in slow motion. He could feel tears welling up as he remembered all the fun he and Susie had together. He could see the sandcastle they made at the beach, the games of tag that he would always let her win, even the time she gave him cooties by kissing his cheek. Finally, He hit the ground as soft as a leaf. The creature skittered from the roof and down the side of the house. It stopped at Susie's window and peered in from above. It had not seen Eddie after all, but the sleeping girl wasn't so lucky. It found her immediately, and then raised its giant clawed hand to the glass of her window. Tap, tap, tap. The long, inhuman fingers gently rapped on the glass. Ed had a sudden realization. It needed her to open the window. It can't get in. It was tapping to wake her up, but when she saw it, she would scream, and her parents would come running and scare the creature away. But, of course, it didn't happen that way. Its head cocked erratically at odd angles. It was becoming impatient. Then, finally, Susie's face appeared at the window. She was looking up at the creature in joyous wonder. Who can say what she saw, but it, whatever it was a lie. Eddie tried to yell, but all he could manage was the slightest gasp. He tried so hard to move, so hard, but he couldn't budge. Susie unlocked the window and lifted it up over her head. Her excitement instantly turned to horror, but she didn't have time to scream before the creature flew in and Eddie could see no more. He felt tears streaming down his cheeks, and he closed his eyes tightly as he could, hoping that this nightmare would end. He held his eyes shut for a long moment, and when he opened them again, the sun was shining through the window of his father's old workshop. The bust was there, but it had gone back to its original position. He walked around to look at it from the front. Its appearance had changed again. Now it looked exactly like his mother. The features were perfect and detailed to an impossible degree. Even the stone looked like flesh. He backed away slowly. "Eddie," his mother embraced him from behind. "Mom." Her hug was tight, but warm and benevolent. He had never been more relieved in his entire life. "What are you doing in here? You know you're not allowed." "Mom, it's alive. It's going to copy you, and it's going to kill you. Then it's going to eat all the kids. Mom, you have to help." "Slow down. What are you talking about?" "The statue, Mom. It's alive." She took a deep breath and spoke soothingly to him. "Statues can't come to life, Eddie." "It's not a statue. It's a monster. Look, it looks just like you now." Barbara turned to look up and saw the bust. "What have you done to your father's favorite project?" she sighed. I didn't do anything. It just turned like that." She looked around, saw the book by the trash can and the ancient one on the table. Then she turned to look at him, crouching down to his level. "How did you get in here?" "I had a dream. The statue took me to the drawer, and there was a key inside. Then the statue turned into a monster, and then it broke my arm." Eddie held up his arm as if to show her, but realized too late that there would be nothing to see. She looked at it skeptically, and Ed realized then that he was in a fight for his life. He had to convince his mother of the truth. He had to. It was becoming a doppelganger. It would copy his mother, kill her, and use her face to hide by day, so that it could eat children by night. He knew it was true. He just had to show her. "It was real. How else would I have found the key?" "I'm not sure. Maybe you saw your dad put it in there. It wasn't exactly a secret. We just wanted to keep it out of your reach. I hadn't even thought about moving it now that you've gotten so big." "I didn't know. And even if I did, how would I know the statue was here before I even saw it?" Ed knew she didn't believe him yet, but he was sure she wouldn't think he was lying. "That statue's been here for years, Eddie. You've kept it in your subconscious, and it came to you in a dream." That happens all the time. The monster is in the book, see? He pointed at it, and she walked over to look. Oh, Eddie, I wish you hadn't seen this. He held his breath. She sounded convinced. A kid your age shouldn't see books like this. But the monster was real. I saw it crawling on the houses, and it ate Susie. Honey, remember when we saw the doctor last year, and he told us you had narcolepsy? Yeah, but I'm on pills, and it hasn't happened for a long time. It happened just now. You suddenly fell asleep while looking at this awful book, and it made you dream of monsters. But Susie, where's Susie? I'm so sorry, baby. You know Susie disappeared last week, but it wasn't a monster. Her mother lost custody, but she was so desperate to be with her daughter that she snuck in and they ran away together. I'm sure little Susie is just fine, and she'll be back soon. That's not true. How could I know she was missing? Because I sat you down and told you about it myself. You were so worried about your friend that you buried that memory deep down, but it came back in your imagination. The statue! It looks just like you, and it grew arms and legs. Even as he said it, he knew that his mother would wipe that argument clean, just like the others. He was barely listening as she told him. You know how you sometimes wake up in a different room than you went to sleep in? Yeah, he replied in a tone of somber defeat. He was losing, and he knew it. You sleepwalk, honey. You took some of my makeup and you made the statue look like me. Plus, it always had arms and legs. They're just too fragile to hold it up. And that's why your father drilled in the pole. Now that he saw them standing side by side, they didn't look so similar after all, but he wasn't ready to give up. He was crying when he spoke next. No, it's a monster. It's gonna kill you, and I'm gonna be all alone with it. She sighed, rolled her eyes, and went to the shelf where the crowbar was kept handy for opening crates. She picked it up and returned to the statue. She paused to look Eddie in the eyes as if telling him, just watch this. She swung. Eddie clenched his body, ready for the statue to raise up its arms and defend itself, which never happened. The crowbar smashed into the stone. She swung again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. She kept beating at it until finally one of its arms broke off. She drew the metal bar back one last time and swung so hard that the statue fell on its side and crashed to the floor with a terrible boom. Breathless, she asked, if it was alive, would it let me do that? No, Mom. Eddie finally gave up. He had always been imaginative. That's what everyone told him. This was just like Santa Claus and the Boogeyman. Nothing but make-believe. All the puzzle pieces of logic came together, and the picture wasn't so bad after all. Part of him hoped he was wrong, and that part spread until it was the only part. Good. Now why don't you go set the table? I'll be down to make lunch after I clean up this mess. Ed did as he was told, but stopped in the doorway, looking back at his mother. Mom, I love you. I love you too, sweetie. When he was gone, she stepped over to where the statue lay, looked at it with a wry smile, and shook her head in bemusement. She crouched down and looked closely for a short second. There was a tiny throbbing line on the side of its neck. Barbara's mouth closed tightly, and with no particular hurry, her lips parted again. The teeth were yellow and jagged in her mouth. Her mouth didn't stop opening. It crept up and up, The nose split, and each inch revealed another inch of teeth. It spread wider and bulged out to make room for yet more teeth to emerge, each the size of a dagger. It struck savagely, deep into the stone throat, which sheared like flesh. Blood spurted from within, and she drank and drank until no more blood flowed. Face covered in red, she looked to the alabaster eyes. "What a talented boy you have." The hideous face moved closer. "Next time, I'll kill him." The creature protracted a huge spiked tongue and cleaned its entire face of blood in a single swath. By the time it sucked the tongue back in, the fangs had transformed back into perfectly innocent human teeth, which smiled in sincere satisfaction. As she lifted the statue, the legs crumbled to dust. Before leaving, the creature checked to make sure there was no trace of any humanity on the stone bust. Afterwards, if anyone had been there to look, they would have seen what might have been a single drop of salt water slide down from the still stone eye. A translation from Susurius es Deus Memortium, whispers from the dead god. Measuring from the base, puncture half an inch above the ear at a 30-degree angle. Apply the apocryphum to a fresh needle and insert into the aperture. Do not insert further than 2 inches into the brain. Attach a copper wire and apply, no direct translation possible, most likely a form of electricity, at unit of measurement unknown. If done correctly, the subject may survive and regain consciousness some hours later. Beware, the subjects always awaken to madness and are hence unpredictable. Most often they will be confused and have trouble focusing their vision. Once consciousness fully returns, they appear to see something that others cannot. It is the sight of this thing alone that drives them to madness. Some subjects will become violent, and if left with nothing to kill or mutilate, will take their own life. Many will lapse into seizure until death. Some, however, will sink quickly into utter, complete, and incurable insanity. By application of this method to a virgin woman, there may result in a cambion. The cambion child will invariably kill the mother during birth, but the child itself will appear completely normal. It is folly, however, to believe the child is human. In its eyes is reflected the vision of all things, not just of this world, but of all worlds and all dimensions. One should never look a cambion in the eyes, lest he see something whose form would break his mortal mind. It is not recommended to allow the cambion to reach maturity before slaughter, lest its cunning overtake thy own. The slaughter must be done on the sacrificial altar with a dagger anointed in the blood of the mother. Once complete, collect the blood and store at 120 degrees Celsius. If the blood is not drained immediately, the body will behave unpredictably. It will most likely morph from its human form into that most resembling its father in this plane. The blood of the organism in this state is unusable. Once the cambion has been drained, its body will solidify and become as stone. Secure it with all the solidity in one's power and as far from civilization as possible. Cambion have been known to be buried in great stone pyramids deep in the desert. Do not attempt to destroy the body. It will always reform elsewhere. The live cambion is dangerous, but a dead cambion is infinitely worse. Its ability to metamorphose is not restricted to its own body, but extends through dream, too. This section is followed by the pages seen by the boy Eddie Morgan prior to the incident on Janet Street. The page following this section has only a single line of text. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die.
The
first rays of sun peeked over the top of the trees before I reached the front door. I peered back over my shoulder, squinting against the light as I fumbled to shake the house key loose from the others and slide it into the lock. But time was against me. In fact, I only just managed to push the door closed before daylight overtook me entirely. Confounded 12-hour shifts, I sighed and leaned back against the door to give my eyes time to adjust to the relative darkness. I'd been the surgeon on call after hours for years, but ever since COVID hit, it had become more of a permanent assignment than simply filling in the gaps. In fact, I'd been on night shift for so long now, I'd almost forgotten what the sun looked like. Once I could see again, I dropped my keys on the table. Almost at the same time, Dorian, my taskmaster, greeted me with a rub against my shin and cursed me with an angry mew. Placing my briefcase and bag of groceries beside my keys, I turned to Dorian. Yes, I know you're hungry, little miss. She sat down on the floor at my feet, staring up at me with her emerald green eyes, judging me as only a black cat can. It couldn't be helped, madam. I had to stop by the market on the way home. The surgeon taking up the morning shift today was late as usual. Dorian cut me off with a meow and glanced from me to the kitchen. Very well, slave driver. I groaned and headed for the pantry. You are quite right, of course. Excuses don't fill empty bellies, do they? Passing the cupboard, I paused to retrieve a wine glass and set it on the table, earning myself yet another chastisement from my mistress. Now, Dorian, you have your needs and I have mine. Or perhaps you would like a turn at being supper. Dorian's eyes narrowed, but being a cat, reacted only to the tone of my voice. Patience, my pet, I cooed in as soothing a voice as I could manage, but even to my ears it sounded cold and emotionless. To be expected, I supposed. It had been a long, frustrating day, and I simply didn't have it in me to pretend anymore. Everything in its time, and this, dear Dorian, is a time to celebrate. I opened the fridge and selected my finest red, a vintage I laid down years ago. I popped the cork and passed the bottle beneath my nose, filling my senses with its wild, passionate bouquet. Ah, Esmeralda, I groaned as her memory came rushing back. You remember her, don't you? The girl with the red hair, the one from Paris, the dancer? I truly did love her, you know. I glanced over at Dorian, watching me with utter disdain from the pantry door, completely unmoved by my profession of love. Philistine, madam, that's what you are, a complete barbarian. I told her, but shook the memory from my mind regardless. Though you are quite right, there's no use living in the past. I tipped the wine to my glass, filled it to the brim, and put the bottle back in the refrigerator. Tonight we drink to the future. But I was often struck by my companion's wisdom, enough to wonder sometimes if I wouldn't have been better foregoing my pursuit of love entirely and find contentment with Dorian alone. Fearing another outburst from my mistress, I opened the pantry and selected an elegant blend of fish and chicken niblets for my companion, before taking my glass in hand and making for my favorite chair. I do go on, but in fact, cats are magnificent creatures, a trifle judgmental perhaps, but proud and loving in their own limited self-serving way. I had only just settled down in my armchair by the fireplace and begun to ponder how similar Dorian and I truly were when my phone vibrated, chasing me from my reverie. I fished my phone out of the front pocket of my pants just in time to see Dr. Wallace's name and number fade from the screen. So you did find your ID then, I snorted. He should have. I left it where even he could hardly miss it, but I supposed it wasn't his fault. Time is so unforgiving to mortals, and The old boy was getting on in years. In fact, now that I thought about it, we were to celebrate his 64th birthday next week. Which reminded me, I too had reason to celebrate. Clara Dane, I said to no one in particular, and swiped a thumb over the screen, bringing it back to life. Dorian hopped on my lap, still licking the last of her supper from her lips as I brought up Clara's Tinder bio. I tipped the phone to show her who I'd selected. What do you think? Do we have a feature? Dorian, for her part, raised her tail, turned 3 tight circles, and lied down in my lap, completely unimpressed. I smiled and lowered my wine glass to stroke her fur with my pinky. In truth, Clara was everything I was looking for. Young, vibrant, with kind, loving eyes. If I knew nothing more about her, it would have been enough. But her bio, the way she described herself, not the words themselves, mind you, the ache behind them, the emotion, the need she felt to pour out her love on someone, to help them. I scratched Dorian under the chin. She stretched out her neck and purred with delight. Quite right, madam. I took a sip from my glass, set it on the table beside my chair, and typed a message to Clara. She's perfect. It's always been fascinating to me, the little awkward dance we do, the moves and counter moves, rather like chess in a way. A ritual made all the more complicated by the trappings of the modern world, and yet at the same time, so very much as it has always been. First encounters being of the utmost importance, and while Clara and I had spoken many times via text and phone over the past weeks, such distant relations cannot compare to meeting someone in person. Everything had to be perfect. For tonight, I selected a venue specifically suited to occasion. Public. After all, this was our first meeting, and as Clara favored Italian cuisine, I thought Gib Alto's would do nicely. A fine establishment, but not so extravagant as to seem pretentious, and popular enough to ensure we would not be alone. As per tradition, I arrived early to make certain our reservations did not pass to another and spoil the evening. But time began to linger. A woman's laugh by the door drew my attention, but it wasn't her. I checked my watch. 20 minutes late. Not to worry. I knew she was coming. If I had learned anything about Clara from our text conversations, it was that she put others' needs before her own. That she was late was actually fortuitous. In her mind, the way she thought, the way she was, it would put her in the offender's seat, the position of guilt, making her more amiable and far more forgiving of my own social failings. No, tonight looked to be a great success. As I pondered, the waiter arrived and cleared his throat. Would the sir like something to drink while he waits for his partner? But of course. I glanced up at him. A glass of tonight's specialty, if you please. Yvonne Red. The waiter sniffed and raised his chin in understanding. My pleasure, sir. And a glass of champagne for my guest when she arrives. His eyes flitted to the chair and his face brightened. It only lasted a fraction of a second, but enough to set my teeth on edge. I kept an eye on him as he turned and weaved through the tables on his way to the kitchens. Foolish, really. A failing on my part, I admit, and one I have been unable to rid myself of despite all my best efforts. As a result, I tried to avoid public settings for these meetings. Too many eyes, too many distractions. Damon? A woman's voice asked. The delicate floral scent of her perfume touched me at the same time as her words, a perfect compliment to her light, quiet voice. Indeed, I answered, spinning to face her as I rose. She wore a blue high-cut dress, tight enough to flatter her figure, while at the same time accentuate her modesty. And you must be Clara. Bowing slightly, I stepped around to pull her chair back from the table. The color rose in her cheeks. Thank you. She brushed her black hair behind her ear and her gaze fell to the floor. She tried to pass it off as merely searching for the chair before she sat down, but the tremble of her fingers and slight quiver in her voice betrayed her. Sorry I'm late, she offered as I pushed her closer to the table. My roommate... I silenced her with a shake of my head. Please, let's not start our evening with regrets. Her blue eyes twinkled as I settled down in my seat across the table. You said in your message that you are a nurse at Mercy General? A noble profession, milady. Milady? She snorted and covered her mouth, trying to hide her deepening blush. For a moment I wondered if I overplayed my hand, but then she rolled her eyes and laid her hand on her lap. Not upset, merely flattered, and perhaps a trifle embarrassed by the snort in her laugh. Innocent, self-conscious, and kind. My lips tugged up at the corners. I could not have asked for a better beginning. Forgive me, I'm a man of old virtues. How would you prefer I address you, madam? Madam, she muttered under her breath and rolled her eyes again. Then with a shake of her hair, Clara straightened her posture and her voice took on the hint of mock sophistication. A relic you may be, sir, but the old ways are most welcome. For this evening, milady and madam will do fine, but in the future, please do me the honor of using my given name. I lifted my water glass in tribute to the old ways, Madame Clara. She raised her glass and tapped it against my own, beaming. May the relics of the past never die. I nodded my agreement and drank to my own longevity. The next few weeks fell into place rather neatly. She worked during the day, I at night, so we met after dark every Saturday evening. We discussed many things. Clara was as open and kind as her picture on Tinder suggested. It wasn't long before she was comfortable enough to divulge even her darkest memories, namely, that when she was a little girl, she lost her father and brother Chris in a car accident. It was a simple enough story. She was 5, her brother 4. From what I gathered, it was one of those dreary nights in late October, raining but on the edge of ice, when a stag broke cover and ran out in front of the car. Her father's reaction was to swerve instead of brake, and he lost control. Clara was thrown clear when the car rolled and forced to watch, to listen, as her loved ones burned to death, trapped in that pile of twisted metal. Oh, how she cried when she showed me the scars marring the flesh across her palms, the cuts and burns she suffered as she clawed at the wreckage, the marks that never let her forget the horror of that day. I pulled her to my chest and wound my fingers through her hair, comforting her as best I could. But there are no words that heal the past. I simply held her in my arms, stroked the back of her head, and whispered gently in her ear how sorry I was until her sobs choked into silence, until her body stopped shaking. When her breath steadied, she whispered, "It was my fault," into my shirt. I should have been in my seat, but Chris, he took my doll. I unbuckled and crawled over the seat to get it back. Dad saw me in the mirror. Her fingernails dug into my back. He only turned around for a second, and whatever composure she fought to maintain crumbled in that moment. I've never been good at empathy, but for her sake I tried. I imagined what it was like being there in her place. The shower of glass, the screams, shock and disorientation as the car rolled over and over. But that's all I could do. Imagine. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but it wasn't your fault. It was an accident. There is no reason to carry that guilt, Clara. Deer appear out of nowhere, and on those conditions, in the dark? I shook my head. Your father was only human. Even if he wasn't distracted, he would have reacted the same. Listen to me. It is not your fault. I know that now, but try explaining that to a 5-year-old. And I know it's stupid, but it still feels like it is. She sniffed into my shirt and tipped up her head to look me in the eye. Anyway, that's why I became a nurse. To sort of make it right, if that makes any sense. Her jaw clenched, her brow peaked, and her lips broke into a strained-looking smile. You probably think I'm crazy. Not at all. I pushed her away, cupped her face between my hands, and wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. You turned your pain into another's blessing, tragedy into mercy. As I said before, it's a noble path you've chosen, Miss Clara, akin to the deeds of the saints of old. Me? A saint? She coughed out a laugh. I told you, no miss, no anything. Just Clara. All right, then. I whispered and bent down so close I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheeks. Just Clara, I whispered, and before she could react, gently pressed my lips to hers. Her body went rigid, but it only took a moment for her to relax, her mouth to open to my kiss. When it had, I slid one hand around the back of her neck and slipped the other down to her lower back. She moaned softly as I stroked the little hairs behind her ear, teasing her skin into goose pimples. She was mine now, eager for more. But I already went as far as I dared. I learned long ago to stay my hand in times like these. Only a fool presses his advantage in the game of love. No. Old saying is quite true. All good things to those who wait. Time marched on as it always does. Clara and I shared many conversations, many long starlit walks with her hand in mine. And I confess, I shared more of my past with her than I had with any other woman that came before. Until at last, months later, when I just opened my final bottle of Esmeralda and realized it was indeed time to bring her home. I pushed open the door, dropped my keys on the table, and backed out of the way, offering Clara a little bow as she entered my home. Welcome to my humble abode. She dipped her chin as she stepped over the threshold, meek and curious. Her focus darted from the war hall on the right to the Zulu war mask a little farther down on her left, dissecting the remnants of my past with each flick of her eyes. Wow, she gasped, walking a little further in. So many relics. It's like being in a museum. No way. She trotted down the hall and crouched by the display case just inside my living room. I thought you were lying. Is this really his surgical set? She traced her finger along the edge of the glass, practically quivering with excitement. The actual René Laennec? I walked up beside her, unlocked the latch, and removed the scalpel from its place. The very same. I palmed the handle, my hand falling around the hilt in a familiar practiced movement before turning it over and offering her the chance to inspect the blade herself. It's like 10 inches long. She pulled her lower lip between her teeth and lifted the knife from my grasp. Can you even imagine what it must have been like? She breathed, taking in the length of the instrument. Doing surgery with daggers like these? That one is for amputations, I offered. Her gaze lifted from the scalpel to me, then returned to the knife in her hand. Hence the length of the blade. But in some ways, these instruments are far superior to their modern counterparts. Feel the balance, the way it comes alive in your hand, and of course it's silver, which serves as a natural counter to biological contaminants as well as killing werewolves. She laughed, cutting me off as she swiped the scalpel through the air as one might a sword. Like Van Helsing. She stepped back, grinning, and pointed the knife at my chest. Stay back, monster. I smiled and raised my arms in surrender. Careful, madam, it's still quite sharp. And besides, Van Helsing hunted vampires, not werewolves. I lowered a hand, palm up, indicating for her to return it to me. Ah, she snorted, then slapped the hilt into my palm. So, silver's useless against a vampire? Indeed. I wiped the flat of the blade against my sleeve to clear the oils of her skin from the surface, tucked the scalpel back into its place, and latched it safely back inside the case. Everyone knows killing a vampire requires driving a wooden stake through his heart. None of the legends mention silver. She bent down, still transfixed by the medical history behind the glass. I just can't believe I'm actually dating the great-great-grandson of the Renee Lineck. Her eyes shone when she turned her focus on me. A whole family line of first-class surgeons. And that's when Dorian entered the scene. She slunk out of the kitchen, head held high, as though the house was hers, and Clara and I were only barely welcome. Ah, yes. I catch Clara's eye and nod to Dorian. I do believe I told you that you were not the only woman in my life. This, my dear, is my companion, Dorian. Dorian, ever ruled by disdain, strode past Clara, ignoring her entirely. She sat down at my feet with a rather indignant-sounding mew and stared up at me expectantly. Yes, madam. I sighed and squatted down beside the true mistress of the house in order to quell her wrath with a stroke of her ears and back. I must again beg your pardon, it seems, but you see, Dorian, the blame does not rest with me entirely this time. Dorian turned her head, blinked at Clara as though she were inspecting a rather disgusting insect, and resumed pretending she didn't exist. I tapped the end of her nose with my finger. Oh, come now, madam. You're being terribly rude. I glanced up at Clara just in time to watch her mouth twitch up at the corners. Forgive me, Dorian, she said with a curtsy. I had no idea we were delaying supper. Unbuttoning her purse, Clara reached into the bag and pulled out a small bit of dried cat jerky. I hope this doesn't mean we can't be friends. Dorian, apparently won over by the tidbit, if not Clara's undeniable charm, abandoned me instantly. She trotted over to rub her leg in the most unabashed display of betrayal I'd seen in many years. Turncoat, I muttered under my breath as I watched Dorian finish the treat and flop over on her back for a belly rub. A regular Benedict Arnold, madam. If this was a time of war, I'd have you flogged. Damon. Clara pouted in a childish scold. I'm surprised at you keeping this itty-bitty kitty waiting when she's so hungry. As if the two of them had forged some mystical feminine bond in the last 20 seconds, Dorian cast me an icy stare and punctuated the gesture with, in my opinion, a completely unnecessary hiss. I clicked my tongue reproachfully and reached over to stroke her neck. So that's how it is, eh? I bring another woman into our lives and now I'm outnumbered. Dorian caught my finger between her paws and pulled it to her mouth to chew on my knuckle. All in play, of course. I caught Clara studying my reaction from the corner of my eye and gave my finger a little shake to free my hand from the tiger's maw. Then I yield, madam. I know when I'm bested, and I dare not risk contending with two hungry ladies. I pushed myself to my feet and offered Clara my hand. Well, my dear, might I suggest you and Miss Dorian retire to the living room whilst I prepare supper? Dinner, I must say, went off without a hitch. The Sangiovese harmonized beautifully with the ravioli. Once I seasoned with it my own special blend of valerian and oregano. In fact, Clara actually moaned when the first bite touched her tongue. Even her eyelids fluttered. I've never tasted anything like it. This is incredible. Her shoulders slumped as she surrendered to the sensation, so distracted she didn't notice me carefully push my own supper off my plate and into the napkin on my lap. I'm glad you approve, I said, once I had removed enough to give the illusion that I'd eaten. It took years to perfect the recipe, but it's really the wine that completes the alchemy. Her right eye cracked open in a slow, lazy motion, warm and deep, intoxicated. It was a look I'd seen many times, in many a woman's eye over the years. Love. The expression leaked from her eyes, down her cheeks in hues of pink, until it reached the edges of her mouth, where it pulled her lips into a soft, warm, comfortable smirk. A great surgeon and a great chef. She sighed and reached for her glass. Never taking her eyes from mine, she lifted the wine to her nose, spun the liquid around the base to release the scent, and offered a toast. To all the great things yet to come. It's an interesting thing how simple, how pure a brief moment can be. Such moments should never be rushed. They need to be savored, for they will never come again. I lifted my own glass, swirling the contents in the same way she had, allowing the moment to linger as I watched my own drink, Esmeralda, swirl thick and slow. But if she did notice the difference between her wine and the thick red liquid in my own glass, she paid it no heed. No, by this point she had completely fallen, blinded by love. I smiled and tapped the edge of my glass to hers. To you, madam, may we enjoy many long years together. The color in her cheeks exploded into full bloom. I watched the smile on her lips spread as she drew back her arm and attempted to hide her face behind her glass. Then she grinned at me over the rim like a naughty child, said, "May we never be parted," and took a sip. Her pupils dilated almost instantly when the sedative hit her tongue, but there was no horror in her eyes, even as consciousness left her. No shock, no hatred. The valerian, mixed with the chemicals in her wine, saw to it that the last thing she would feel was pure, unadulterated ecstasy. I watched her arm twitch twice as she fought against the drug, the glass tip and spill as it rolled from her fingers, her body slump forward and fall on the table. She mumbled something, a question I could only guess at, and then Clara fell silent. I gave Esmeralda a swirl, drank the final remnants of my last romance, and offered Clara a promise. In a way we never shall, madam. I'll remember you always. On that, you have my word. During the next few moments, I retired to the basement to make my final preparations. Once everything was ready, I hefted Clara's body on my shoulder and brought her down as well. I carefully laid her on the mortician's table I had procured specifically for her, raised the head a few inches, and gently fastened the straps around her head, arms, and legs. She moaned, struggling to awake as the effect of the drugs began to wane. I leaned over her head and watched her eyelids flutter. Those beautiful blue eyes that always looked at me with such awe, such love. For a moment, I almost felt something, a twinge of an ache deep within my chest. Regrets? Sorrow, perhaps? I reached out and swept a stray hair from her face. No matter. When Clara's eyes cracked open, the sensation passed. Damon? Her voice shook when she regained enough of her senses to speak. What's happening? Where am I? Her arms strained against the straps. What are you doing? Only what I must, I replied, reaching under the table to show her the empty bottle with a new label, the gold-flowing script I chose in her honor. Clara, I read, letting my finger trace the letters. Beautiful label, don't you agree? Clara's eyes flicked to my old surgical tools laid out beside her on the tray, and her skin turned pale. But I don't think she really understood what was about to happen. Not until I took up the scalpel she threatened with me so playfully earlier and dipped it in the alcohol. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Damon, stop. You don't know what you're doing. You don't want to do this. You love me. Clara's voice trembled. And I love you. I tipped the silver blade back, pressing the point against my lip as I considered everything that led to this moment. The Tinder account and all that followed. All the carefully orchestrated steps I took to ensure that her heart would belong to me and me alone. The months I spent planning. drawing her in with perfect precision. Yes, I know you do. I turned around and tightened the straps binding her to the table, pausing only long enough to watch a single tear trace down her cheek. I tilted my head to the side and laid the knife along her skin to catch it on the blade. If you didn't, then your sacrifice would be useless. I lifted the knife, allowing the teardrop to dangle from the edge. You see, Clara, the scalpel did not belong to my grandfather, or his. It is mine. It has always been mine. I've kept these tools all these years, to remind me of what I was before. She whimpered and struggled against her bonds, but it was a frail attempt. She couldn't help but love me. Not anymore. Her love was unconditional, real, pure. I slipped my arm free of my sleeve, sliced open a thin line at the base of my wrist, infecting my immortal soul with her weakness, her strength. It burned. A sharp breath stabbed at my lungs as the sensation took hold. Sadness, betrayal, fear, and love. Emotions so strong I hadn't felt their like for over 1,000 years. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I needed to feel it again, to experience what she felt every time she looked at me, every time she thought of me. The pain faded, the emotions passed, and Clara's face came back into focus, open-mouthed and trembling. I am René Linex's descendant. I am he. I was turned many centuries ago, but contrary to legend, vampires don't drink blood to stay alive, I told her. I drink it so that I may live, so I can experience emotion and pass as human. But you are quite special to me, Clara. I reached under the sink attached to the foot end of the table, opened the valve to the tank it fed, and placed the point of the blade just under her rib cage. Your blood will ensure my humanity for a long time to come. I braced my other hand on the butt of the hilt, preparing for the initial cut, bracing myself against the scent of blood to come.
Will you tell us the story again, Dad? Yeah, Dad. Tell us about little Johnny's cave. Please? I still remember those days, sitting around a campfire in the backyard and listening to Dad tell that story. It was our favorite, Little Johnny's Cave. It was as cheesy as spooky campfires got back then, and you can bet me and my little sister Linda ate every bit of it up. He himself didn't care too much for telling it, though. At the time, me and Linda really didn't understand why. I guess to us it was just his way of trying to build tension, you know? Kinda like how you try to sound dramatic when you urge someone to not go looking for this or that, or don't do this, or the monster is gonna get you. Now, though, I realize it wasn't that at all. Looking back, I can remember the look he'd always get on his face when we'd beg him to tell that story. It was cold, sunken, sad, or scared even. Both, probably. It was a look that said, why do I have to talk about this? It only hurts when I do. Like I said, though, we were too young and way too excited to know or really care. I guess, in our defense, can't really expect much better from a couple of first graders who thought their dad was the coolest, coupled with a childhood filled to the brim with watching classic monster movies, can you? In any case, he'd go silent for a while, probably a solid 5 minutes or more, and just stare intently into the fire. Me and Linda knew when he saw this that things were about to get good, even if it sounded no different than the last 100-something odd times we'd heard the Little Johnny's Cave tale, and usually it didn't. It was still the peak of the evening, the main event of the night. I can still see it, the way he stared coldly and distantly at the fire as he took several deep breaths, readying himself. Me and Linda always scooted closer, grabbing another marshmallow to char and stuff our faces with, while we listened. When he'd begin, he always furrowed his eyebrows intensely with concentration. A long time ago, two little boys, about y'all's age now, ran off to play hide-and-seek while they was on vacation up here in Greenview Pines. That was their favorite game, see? They loved trying to find each other in them dense woods. Them trees, you see, they was always tall and big around, and they grouped together. This made it easy for little fellas like these two boys to get themselves lost. But that was part of the fun, you see. They liked getting lost. That's why they played it so much. They always pushing to see how long it'd take them to find each other. Well, soon they figured out the woods. Started memorizing which trees made good spots to hide, which ones weren't. You see, they was getting bored. So one day they was walking out in the woods, looking at all the big tall green trees, wondering how to make the game more fun. That's when the little brother, Colin, saw what looked like a big old cave in the side of the mountain. Now this cave was big enough to fit the three of us in there, 5 times over, all at once. But what was even better was how dark it was. See, in that cave, not even the sun could break through. It was dark. It was spooky. There was no way his brother would find him in there. "Bet you'll never find me, Johnny," little Colin shouted to his older brother before running off into the cave. Johnny, caught off guard, shouts to little Colin to wait up. But now, of course, little Colin was eager. He wanted to get hit quick before his big brother could be able to find him. It wasn't long before Johnny couldn't see Colin no more, disappearing into that deep dark cave. "Colin!" he'd shout as loud as he could. "Colin, where you going?" But little Colin didn't answer. He was long gone. Johnny started searching frantically for his little brother. When he found the cave, he saw little Colin running too. He tried calling out his name one more time. "Colin, where are you?" From inside the cave, Johnny heard what sounded like the pattering of little feet across the stone floor, going deeper into the cave. Wanting to catch up to his little brother, Johnny starts running into the cave after him. He ran and ran, deeper and deeper into the cave. But it seemed like the longer he ran, the more the cave seemed to stretch. The deeper he went, the darker it became. Soon, Johnny couldn't see anything at all. All he could do was follow the soft pattern of little Colin's footsteps. Johnny was getting scared now. He wanted to go home, but more than that, he just wanted to find his little brother. "Colin!" he cried. "Colin, where are you?" Still, all he heard was little feet. He kept following them until suddenly, Johnny thought he could smell something burning. The smell was strong, and he could feel smoke burning in his eyes, like this fire here. From ahead, in the dark part of the cave, there was a voice that called out to Johnny. A voice that sounded like a snake that was being choked. "Just a little closer. Come on, just a little closer, little boy." Now, Johnny knew that wasn't his little brother's voice, but he didn't know what to do. He was scared now, terrified, in fact. The burning smell got closer and closer. The fumes from the smoke were making him gag now. "You can't escape me, little boy. You're mine now," the voice hissed. This made Johnny want to run, take off back for home. But soon he was turned around. The exit was gone. No sunlight, no hole at the other side of the cave. Nothing. What was he going to do? He could feel something getting close now, from deep inside the cave, something bad. "You're mine now. You'll never leave my cave." Johnny was terrified and was about to take off the way he came when, from inside the cave, he heard what sounded like a little boy screaming. Wasn't just any little boy either. Johnny knew it was his little brother. "Colin!" he shouted. But his little brother only kept screaming, squealing like someone has put his little foot in a bear trap. "I'm coming, Colin!" He took off, running deeper and deeper. The further he went, the louder and more painful his little brother's screaming got. Along with this, Colin smelled something burning again, kind of like his weenier and roasting here. See? But Johnny just kept on running. He had to keep going. He had to rescue his little brother. The screaming got louder and louder. "Colin!" he screamed. "I'm coming, Colin! Hold on!" He couldn't see nothing no more. Everything was dark. All he could hear was his little brother squealing until eventually he tripped over something. When he looked up, there were now 2 large white evil eyes beating down on him. Little Johnny froze. He couldn't move. Then, from under the eyes, the monster opened his mouth and grinned, showing off long, sharp teeth. The monster held something up in front of a little Johnny that finally made him wet himself, screaming. The monster's hand was little Colin. Little Johnny tried to reach for him. Little Colin's skin suddenly caught fire, burning away all his skin till he was nothing but bones. "Now it's your turn," the monster told him. That's when the monster tried grabbing him. Little Johnny was too quick. The monster missed, and little Johnny took off, heading back quick as his little legs carried him back toward the entrance of the cave. Just like before, he ran and ran. You could hear the monster hot on his little tail. He couldn't stop running, else he was a goner. Eventually, little Johnny realized, like how, when he came in, he couldn't see any light ahead. No matter how far he ran, it only got darker and darker in the cave. He couldn't see, and his legs were getting tired, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep going, or the monster was going to get him. So he just kept running. They say he still is today running around in that deep, dark cave, still trying to find his way out. If you see the cave, listen real close. You'll hear his little feet. Tap, tap, tap. Still trying to get out. His voice would always sound cold when he finished. He never said anything like, "the end," or tried to make any exaggerated faces to signal that he was just trying to give his kids a good spook. No, the man's face was like stone, chiseled and stoic. And for a long time, we'd all just sit in silence. Me and Linda just absorbing the story and its intensity once again, while the old man would just sit there, staring dead silent, almost like he was in a trance at the fire. Like I said, I've heard that exact same story word for word, at least 100 or more times growing up. He never tried to change it, like so many others do when trying to tell the same story over and over again, to keep it fresh or whatever. No, each and every time it was always the same story, details and all, verbatim, always with that same stone-cold stare. Looking back, I think even then I noticed this, which made me all the more fascinated with it. See, when he told that story, he wasn't just telling a campfire story to a couple of kids, but it was like he was telling something that happened to him in a way. I guess that was the other reason we loved it so much. The way it felt so real. And again, he never tried to embellish or exaggerate anything with the way he sounded. He told the story, and that was what happened. Every time. Of course, eventually, time moved on, and so did we, sort of. Me and Linda grew up, made friends to go hang out with, got involved with clubs or sports, and just generally ditched our backyard campfire tradition on the weekends. That said, and though I couldn't speak for Linda at the time, that story, Little Johnny's Cave, was still one of the coolest things to me. I remember how I used to always try and tell my friends the story, either at lunch or at recess. Of course, I knew they didn't believe it like I did. I couldn't tell it like Dad would. I'd always end up somehow giving away that it was just a story. No matter how hard I tried to look and sound as cold or distant as the old man, I just couldn't pull it off. I guess I just couldn't make it real like him, you know? That was the other thing. I always wondered how or why he was able to make it real like that. What was his secret? What gave him that edge? What made him go cold when we asked him to tell that story? What scared him so much about it? Back then, I never really tried asking him. I guess, I felt like that wouldn't do me much good, outside of getting fed some BS like, "That's just me spooking you. There's no cave," or something lame like that. Or B, I just felt like that would have been too easy, you know? I mean, that's always half the fun with this stuff, isn't it? Imagining you're the one tumbling down the rabbit hole. But in real life? I remember how I'd daydream often in class. And yes, this did result in awkward situations. Or at nighttime, I'd be the one running off into little Johnny's cave. I'd run deeper and deeper, losing myself in the darkness. I'd run into the monster, imagining it to be this hulking beast, or even the devil, with long teeth and claws, able to breathe fire like a dragon, and he'd try to chase me, but I'd always outrun him. Of course, in my dreams, I'd always find my way back out again, and sometimes, instead of running, I'd stand and fight the monster, always winning, of course. Point is, it had an impact on me back then, and it never went away, even now. Though now, seeing the truth behind what happened, it has a much bigger impact on me, one that's far more real, and far more haunting than even Dad could have made it seem around the fire. It was a couple of weeks ago. Classes at college had just ended for the year, and I was throwing a party with some of my dorm mates to celebrate. Like all parties, we had chips, dip, music, the hottest chicks on campus, and plenty of beer with a little extra on the side if you take my meaning. It had been going wild all night until about 2:30 in the morning when most, at least the ones still conscious, started heading out. I and a couple other close friends, however, were still wide awake. I was vegged out across the couch, with Larry sprawled out in one of the beanbag chairs on the floor, and Eddie in the recliner on the right, all of us damn near completely wasted. I guess because we were bored or because we were just out of our senses, it was suggested that we have ourselves a little contest on who could tell the scariest story. Basically, the deal was that we'd all tell one and vote at the end as to whose story was the scariest. Larry went first with some generic story about a guy who gets murdered with his hands coming back to kill people, or something like that. Eddie followed that up with an equally cheesy, quote-unquote, true encounter with the Wendigo. You could tell it was fake when he describes the way he fought the creature and escaped with his life. They were goofy as hell, sure. Not scary in the slightest, but all the same, enjoyable enough to listen to, at least when you're intoxicated. When it came to be my turn, though, you bet your ass I told the story of Little Johnny's cave. Like before, I tried as much as ever to mimic the way Dad told the story, though I personally doubted it actually felt like when he did it. It seemed to achieve the same effect, sure enough, judging from the looks of speechlessness on my friends' faces when I finished. "Dude," Larry exclaimed, "I think you just won." He snickered while Eddie just continued staring in shock at me. "Where'd you come up with that one?" I chuckled. I didn't. I grew up hearing that one. Larry's eyes went wide with amazement again, mouthing, "Holy crap." "Grenview Pines," Eddie piped up, still staring somewhat nervously at me. Me and Larry looked over at him. Didn't y'all say that happened in Greenview Pines? Yeah, why? I've heard of that place before. My folks used to go hiking up there. He shook his head. Just my folks. They used to go there when I was younger whenever they wanted some alone time, away from me and my brothers for a weekend. They'd even bring back these cool little stones as souvenirs for us kids. They also used to talk about how pretty it was there. He snickered before adding, or at least they tried to, though God knows we didn't give a damn about listening to him back then. Oh, so you didn't think they've ever seen the cave? He thought for a second before shrugging. They may have. Hell, them gems they used to bring back had to come from somewhere. Like I said, though, I never really bothered paying much attention when they tried talking about their trips. Sounds like you in history class, Larry quipped. Eddie smirked and flipped him off. Guess some things never change, huh? I snorted at this. It was true. He usually did end up falling asleep during almost every world civilizations lecture. Granted, they were 6 a.m. classes. The coffee shops on campus wouldn't open until 7. Lucky for him, I, being a good friend that I am, always sat behind him and made sure to wake him up when the professor arrived to begin. Hey, Larry piped up again. Bro, I just had an idea. We looked at him. Why don't we take a trip up there? Me and Eddie looked at each other and then back to Larry. Think about it. We've always been talking about trying to hang out somewhere for a weekend once class is ended. Why not? He looked at me and said, who knows? We might even stumble on Little Johnny's cave. He followed this up by making ghost noises with his big eyes. Eddie and I snickered at this. Hell, I'd be down, I said, turning to Eddie. What about you, Ed? Want to join in? He thought for a moment before replying. Can't. I'm already booked to spend most of the summer with Hannah and her folks at the beach. Larry scoffed. Typical, passing up time with your friends to hit the beach with your girl, huh? I laughed again. It really was amusing to watch these two go at it. Ed just rolled his eyes and flipped them both barrels. Larry sighed and said, well, looks like it's you and me, bro. Right on, I replied, excited. We fist bumped and Eddie looked at his watch before saying he had to head back to his dorm to pack for his trip to the beach. After teasing him again, we wished him luck and then he left. For about a week or so, when I wasn't packing, I started looking at Greenview Pines online. From the pictures I saw, I could tell you one thing. These folks weren't kidding when they said it was pretty. Let's just say either someone had the most high-def quality camera or some seriously wicked editing skills when taking these pictures, or the place was just so beautiful that none of that was necessary to make them look so good. The place was huge, too, with an abundance of hiking trails. Plenty of areas to travel through, as well as get yourself lost in. Curious, I looked around to see if there were any caves in the area, either pictured or listed in an article. Found one or two that were pictured, but no real details on them as far as what they were like on the inside, or how deep they went, etc. That led me to actually try Googling Little Johnny's Cave. Of course, nothing really came up, which was about what I'd expected, but still, nothing lost in trying, right? Though I was able to find an old news article entitled, Little Boy Declared Missing in Mountain Cave. Intrigued, I clicked on it, taking me to a forum post from a couple years back with the article. The article itself was dated back in early June of 1961. It was a pretty quick read, admittedly, with a clear lack of any real details. Basically, it read that a family went on a trip to the mountains that summer, and their 2 boys, 2 elementary school best friends, obviously neither of which were named in print or pictured in the post, went off one afternoon to play in the woods. Apparently, though, come nightfall, neither of them came back. It took a little over a week, even having to get the state troopers to canvass the entire mountainside with a fine-tooth comb, before finally one of the brothers was found again, but not the other. According to the article, when the boy was found, understandably petrified, he kept crying to authorities that he lost his friend. There wasn't anything I was able to find after that, though, other than that the missing boy, even after a massive 2.5-year search, was never found. I tried doing a search for the article itself, wondering if maybe I could dig up anything else, like where in the mountains or even which mountain. This resulted, though, in the same headline being brought up, with no other sordid details, basically meaning it was more or less the same thing from the forum post. The only difference this time being that the boys were both pictured in this one. The one that was missing I didn't recognize, but the other one they found, did look somewhat familiar. It reminded me of the way I looked back in my old elementary school pictures. When I looked to see where the paper was printed, though, I saw that it was from a small town area located just a little ways down from Glenview Pines. Well, at least there's some connection, I thought, finally deciding to call it quits. I knew now that something actually happened in Glenview a long time ago, and it involved a little boy going missing. Of course, what I didn't know was where, given that no specific area in the mountainside was mentioned when detailing where the boys went missing or where the first one was found, including any mention of a cave. It was that Friday that me and Larry hit the road. The drive itself was largely a quiet one after about the first half hour after leaving town. That was until we actually got into Glenview Pines, where neither one of us could stop gawking at the scenery. Remember what I said about the online photos? Well, I could see now that there was no kind of editing involved. All of it was 100% real. We actually spent a good 20-something odd minutes or so just driving around, sightseeing. Eventually, Larry spotted an overlook area close to a nearby trail where we could park, and we got out and stretched our legs. To save space, we decided early on that we weren't going to bother with tents or anything like that for this trip, opting to just sleep in my SUV for a few days that would be there. So with just clothes on our backs and our small backpacks, we headed into the woods. It was about 1:30 when we started. I figured we'd be able to hike for a few hours and then head back to the SUV around 6, making it back before sunset when it would get dark. As we went along, the trees seemed to get more and more grouped together, almost compacted. Even in spite of this, they seemed to stand out all the same, individually. Each of them were tall and broad, all of them with lush, lively green leaves. Some of them, particularly, of course, the younger ones, I noticed weaved in intricate ways, competing for sunlight. Because of this, losing ourselves in the scenery like this, I actually damn near forgot completely about the time. Coincidentally, it was right as we'd stopped at a small clearing, a break off from the trail with a small riverbank, and undoubtedly the clearest and most beautiful creek I'd ever seen, and probably ever would see in my entire life. Larry thought to ask me what time it was. My eyes went wide when I saw that it was already 4. "We gotta head back," I said. "Damn," Larry replied. "Can't we rest for a bit?" I looked at the sky. The sun was just starting its downward trek toward the horizon. "It's gonna get dark soon, dude. And with the trees as close together as they are, it'll be impossible to see anything once the sun goes down. And we don't have any flashlights either." Yeah, okay, I'm coming." He grunted as he made his way back up to his feet. "It's a shame, too," he said. "This would have made for a nice little R&R spot." He shrugged and said, "Oh well, maybe tomorrow." I noticed he seemed to trail off at the end of his last sentence, directing his focus to something off to my right. "What?" I asked him. "What is it?" Is that, I began. Is that what I think it is? What? What are you talking about? He pointed in the direction he was looking. I didn't see anything at first. I don't see anything. What's up? You don't see that? The opening of that cave over there? My heart slowly started to beat faster. Now, concentrating closer, sure enough, there it was. A large opening in the side of the mountain. Yeah, I see it. He started off towards it. Wait, what are you doing? I want to see inside it. It'll only take a moment, I promise. He jogged over to it, and I quickly followed after him. We both ran to the cave, noticing the eerie way it sort of got bigger the closer we came to it. We then stopped just outside of the mouth, and we saw that it was at least 30 or so feet long, and at least 20 or 30 something feet wide. Enough to fit the three of us inside 5 times over. From the entrance, I couldn't see anything inside. Not even a foot ahead of us was visible. Everything was a black, seemingly boundless hole in the mountainside. So dark not even the sun could break through. Now a shiver was crawling up and down my spine. This couldn't be. Could it? I was completely speechless, looking at it from the mouth. Fear and excitement was slowly building in the pit of my stomach at the same time. Had I done it? Had I just found my fabled little Johnny's cave? What was in there? Would I hear his footsteps echoing off the walls of the cave? Would I run into the monster? Curiously, I actually kept my ear at the entrance to see if I could hear the soft pattering of little feet across the stone. I heard something that had a similar tempo, for lack of any better words, to footsteps, but I couldn't tell what they were. Probably just droplets of dew from the limestone or something, I told myself. But even still, my imagination couldn't help but kick into maximum overdrive by this point. What's in there? I don't know exactly how long I stood there, gawking in amazement like this. Another 20 minutes, maybe? Could have it been 30? But it was shattered abruptly when I watched Larry start shambling inside. Larry, wait! I called to him. Don't worry. I just want to go for a look for a minute. I'll be right back. Just hold on. I watched him start to walk deeper and deeper, running his hand along the wall of the cave. I looked at the sky. Now the sun was already a quarter of the way down. Dude, we don't have time. We can come back tomorrow. It's going to get dark soon. Inside the cave, already mostly gone from sight, I heard Larry shout back, teasing. What, you afraid of the dark? You scared the monster gonna get you? I then heard him walk deeper into the cave, disappearing completely from view. Dude, come on, quit screwing around. We need to get back. I got no response this time. I sighed. Fine. But when you're stumbling around, lost in the woods in the dark, don't come crying to me. With that, I turned and started to make my way back to the SUV. I didn't make it but 5 feet away, however, before I realized that Larry had the keys to the SUV. I'd given them to him in the event we had an emergency run back, also known as he forgot something, as he often tended to do. Damn it, I thought, slapping my forehead. Now I had to go after him. Almost without thinking, I sprinted into the cave. Larry, I shouted. Hey, come on, man, seriously. We need to go. No answer. Larry? I slowed down. Everything was dark around me, a silent black void. I took up my phone and turned on the flashlight, which at best lit up a small radius around me, but basically nothing else. All I could see was the dark, solid stone of the cave around me. Taking another look at my phone, I realized I was screwed again when I saw that the battery life read 25%. Great. Larry, I called again. Damn it, come on, it's 6 now. The sun's already set. Silence. Where the hell is he? Where'd he go? He couldn't have gotten that far, could he? I started walking further, albeit a good bit slower, more hesitant. I couldn't suppress a shiver that shook through my body in a uniformed convulsion. I won't lie, I was actually getting nervous here, scared even. Even with the light I had, the dim, almost dead, and already near useless amount of it, all I could see ahead of me was darkness. Maybe darkness isn't the word for it, though. Maybe void would be more appropriate. See, it wasn't just dark. It wasn't just dead silent. It was empty. Ahead of me was basically a black hole that looked and felt like it went on for eternity without end. Of course, though, it has to end somewhere, right? I wondered, trying to grasp onto some kind of hope. It's only just a cave, right? We can't stretch that much further, can it? Is this what it was like for... I stopped, shaking my head. I wasn't about to start nurturing the idea. Get a grip. Just find Larry's dumbass and get out. My heart shook when I heard an ear-splitting shriek in the distance. Larry! Immediately, I broke from my stupor and took off further into the cave where I heard the noise. I could hear groans of pain trailing from ahead. Larry, hang on, I'm coming! The more I ran, despite seeming to get closer to where the sounds were coming from, I still seemed at the same time to somehow get no closer to it. Larry, where are you? Here. I heard from somewhere off to my left. Are you okay? He groaned. I think my leg's broken. My eyes widened and I ran at full speed in his direction. Because I couldn't see anything, though, that meant I couldn't see him either. That is, until I ended up tripping right over him, face-planting right into the stone ground of the cave. Larry let out another shriek of pain. Damn it! It was my leg! Larry, hold on, I said, scrambling for my bag. I started shuffling around until I was able to find the quote-unquote first aid kit I brought, also known as a Ziploc bag with a thing of Band-Aids, Neosporin rubbing alcohol, and a large roll of gauze. I pulled out the gauze and started looking around for a stick or something to use as a splint. Larry was in hysterics, writhing and clutching his leg. Calm down, breathe, I said as I started to bandage a nearby twig to his leg, having, luckily, managed to find a decent enough sized stick. He couldn't, though. He was in too much pain, and I was worried he'd start going into shock. I pulled a water bottle from my bag. Here, keep this against your leg. It's not ice, but it's all I got. He managed to calm down just a little when I said this. Enough, at least, to actually hold the bottle against his leg. I knew he was going to need serious medical attention, but when I went to try and use my phone, unsurprisingly, there was no service. As well as this, the battery was almost dead, which meant that it wouldn't be long before I'd end up losing what little light I had to work with. I started looking frantically around for something, anything to use for making a fire. Finally, I was able to find a couple of rocks lying around that, looking closer, looked like they might be obsidian. Take off your shirt. What are you doing? Larry groaned as I began taking off my own shirt and setting them in a pile, with the remaining sticks underneath them, before scraping the rocks together. Hoping for a miracle, I replied. Sure enough, said miracle was granted, and a spark was generated. The shirts caught almost immediately. I knew it wouldn't last long, but maybe, if we were careful, it could last long enough to find us a way out. Of course, that was a hell of a lot easier said than actually done. With no signal, no other source of light, and Larry's leg, bent in every different way from what it's supposed to be, we were essentially stuck. I tried for the first time to look behind my back to the exit. It was then, though, that I found that I couldn't see the other side. At first, I thought it was just because it was nighttime. But after looking back towards the fire, I realized that it wasn't. It wasn't just dark, it was empty. In other words, the opening was completely gone, almost like it hadn't been there at all. What the hell? I said aloud. What is it? The opening, the way out, dude. It's gone. He groaned, struggling to bring his head up. What are you talking about? It's right... Wait. What the hell? His eyes were wide open again, despite having been in excruciating pain. He started hyperventilating. Where's the exit? Calm down. I'm gonna get us out of here. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Me and Larry's head snapped backward toward the depths of the cave at the same time. My heart stopped cold. What in the name of God was that? Stomp, stomp, stomp. What the hell, dude? Larry cried, hyperventilating again. From ahead, there was still nothing visible but darkness, yet the stomping got closer and closer. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Panic flooded through me. I could feel every urge, every instinct, trying to force me to move, to take off and run, but I couldn't. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Larry started squirming. We gotta get out of here, man, he squealed. We gotta get out of here. He started struggling to drag himself towards me. Stomp, stomp, stomp. That was when I realized that the fire I'd made was fading. I noticed, though, that it wasn't exactly like it was flickering or anything like that. It was more like it was dimming, like it was being sucked away or siphoned by the darkness ahead. The same was true with my phone, seeing it start to flicker before going completely dark again. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The more the fire faded, the more I realized that the darkness was actually moving closer to us. With each earth-shattering step towards the two of us, I could see the black wall of nothing inch closer and closer, swallowing more and more of the cave with it. It was right on top of us when the fire finally blinked out like an old light bulb. We were engulfed in darkness again. Total, pure, and unadulterated darkness. Stomp, stomp, stomp. Larry, I cried, spinning in circles, completely blind. Larry, where are you? I got no response from him. Instead, I was only met with a stomping. When I ran forward to try and find him, I felt something pull and stretch me from every different direction all at once, trying to pull me apart. I looked to see what it was, but still saw nothing. Only darkness. The darkness itself was attempting to rip me apart. It was alive, and it was hungry. Larry! I called out again, straining. He made no reply. The darkness must have already taken him. The longer I stayed in the darkness, the more I felt as though it was trying to sear the flesh from my bones. In the back of my mind, I could hear those words coming back to me. The monster. You're mine now, and you'll never leave my cave. That's when I realized what I had to do. I had to do what little Johnny did. I had to run, summoning every bit, every minute reserve of stamina I had in me, and then some. I turned and bolted like a bat straight out of hell toward the exit, or at least where I first thought the exit originally was. It was a struggle to move or even breathe. The stomps were in hot pursuit behind me. Like with before, all I could see was blackness ahead. The feeling of being stretched was coming from all around me now. The darkness had me encircled, yet I still ran. I couldn't stop. I have to get out! Because of this, I don't know how long, or really how far I'd run, when I'd suddenly tripped and was sent tumbling. I could feel an excruciating pain shoot through my right arm when I tried breaking my fall, clearly having broken it. I struggled back to my feet and started sort of limp running. As much as it hurt, I had to keep going. I could feel my lungs starting to ache. I was afraid at any second I'd collapse again, and this time I wouldn't be able to will myself back up. Then the darkness, the cave, and the monster would have me like it had Larry. Stomp, stomp, stomp. I'm not going to make it. Then, as if an angel was extending me some sort of blessing or divine intervention, I saw, dead ahead, through the darkness, the opening of the cave. I pushed my body beyond all limit to break into a sprint for it. Behind me, I could hear it quickening its own stride, realizing that I was about to get away. It was getting desperate. Stomp, 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 stomp. In one last burst, I launched myself from where I was standing out of the cave. Once again, I was sent rolling and tumbling into the woods. When I finally landed still, my body instantly racked all over, with aches and pains in almost every part of my body. I opened my eyes and looked up. Above me was the night sky, dark silhouettes of trees leering over me. I'd have jumped for joy if not for the pain coursing through me. I'd done it. I made it. I'm alive. I was able to let out a strained laugh of relief. The feeling was soon replaced with alarm. Larry! He's still in there. I looked up and over to the cave. I wanted to go back for him, to rescue him from the cave, just like little Johnny with his little brother. At the same time, though, I knew that'd be no good. Even if he were still alive, not consumed by the darkness like how I almost was, I was in no shape to be able to get him out of there. Thoughts flooded my head, imagining Larry screaming in terror, his skin being slowly burned away until only his bones remained. What do I do? In the end, I decided to try heading back to the SUV, where I'd then drive out to the nearest town to find help. Admittedly, I wasn't sure what good anybody else would do, given that it wasn't like I could give any sort of detail as to where in the mountain the cave was. Plus, I knew the chances of finding him inside, even what could have been left of him, alive or dead, would be wafer slim to absolutely none. It was difficult, having to try and backtrack in the dark, exhausted and in a lot of pain from my arm, as well as the effects of the darkness still only slowly wearing off, but I couldn't have cared less. I was determined to make it back to my vehicle. Eventually, come the very beginning of daybreak, I found the SUV again. The last speck of energy was spent shambling for and inside. After that, completely spent physically, emotionally, and mentally, I just laid back in my seat and let exhaustion overtake me. When I awoke again, it was broad daylight outside, and my body still ached. I knew with my hand I wouldn't be able to drive. When I tried to use my phone, it wouldn't turn on. Looking around, though, I found that Larry had left his phone in the SUV. Another stroke of luck found me when I saw that from where I was, I actually had service and was able to call for help. It was about an hour and a half that I just sat in the SUV before an ambulance was able to arrive. From that point to now, only a few days later, much of this is just history. I was, of course, taken to the hospital where I recovered. When asked what happened, I just said that I fell while hiking the mountain. I didn't try telling the doctors, or anyone else for that matter, about the cave or Larry. Why bother? It's not like they could even find it, much less help. I also feigned ignorance when trying to figure out what was causing me to feel weak all over, drained. I was finally discharged a few hours later, where I then returned home. The whole way, all I could do was think about everything that just happened. What was that in the cave? I mean, I know it was darkness, sure, but how was it so alive? This led me to finally break my little unspoken rule I'd talked about earlier, and ask the one person who'd actually be able to possibly give me some proper answers. Dad. It was yesterday morning that I decided to pay him and Ma a visit. They, of course, were ecstatic that I was in town, and I told them that I was glad to see them. For a while, I just sat and just talked with the both of them for a while until Ma said she, regrettably, had to leave to play bingo with friends. After she left, that was when I finally decided to ask Dad. Like he would back then when I was little, his face dropped abruptly into that trademark look of stoicism. Dad, I pushed. Where'd you hear that story from? Who told it to you? He just stared coldly at me. Nobody told me, son. He replied in a grave tone. I didn't hear it either. I saw him shudder. He didn't say anything else after that. Obviously, I wanted to push him, but I could tell I'd already spoiled the cheer from earlier. As it turned out, though, he wouldn't need to say anything more anyway. As I apologized and was about to leave, Dad stopped me and thrusted something into my chest. If you really want the truth, he said, I'll tell you all you need to know about little Johnny's cave. He then turned and walked away while I did the same, tucking it away in my pocket. It was when I returned back to the dorm that I looked at what he gave me. It was an old photo of two little boys in what looked to be the woods, with one of the boys presumably being him, judging by how familiar he looked, while the other was someone I didn't recognize at all. Though a closer look set my head spinning. I realized that these just weren't any two boys. They were the ones pictured in the articles online. I also recognized the woods to be the clearing from Grenview Pines, where we'd found the cave. The boy, standing next to Dad, had a circle drawn around him in red, and under it were the words, I haven't forgotten you, Colin. John. That's when it all clicked. That's when I finally understood, after all these years and after what happened to me, why Dad was always so scared of that story. I understood just how real it finally was. He was little Johnny. He lost his best friend, a brother, to the darkness of the cave like I lost Larry. Because of this, even though he made it out in the end, there was, and would always be, a part of him that's trapped there, surrounded and being ripped apart by the darkness, trying still to find its way out again. And now, the same is true for me. I'm going to end this by saying that there's a reason to fear the dark. It's a mysterious thing, capable of feats evidently still not yet known. As well as this, it's hungry, and unless you run to the light, it will take you and devour you the way it did my friend and almost did with me. I don't know if Larry could still be alive. I doubt it, of course. But part of me still wants to hope that he's still in there, still running to find a way out. Sometimes, I think I even hear it. His footsteps, still trying to get out.